Section 47 of a Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1, by George Lillie CRAIK, Chapter 4, Part 23. Daniel. The great work of Samuel Daniel, who was born at Taunton in Somersetshire in 1562 and died in 1619, is his civil wars between the two houses of Lancaster and York in 8 books, the first 4 published in 1595, the 5th in 1599, the 6th in 1602, the 2 last in 1609, the preceding books being always, we believe, republished along with the new edition. He is also the author of various minor poetical productions, of which the principal are a collection of 57 sonnets entitled Delia, his Musophilus, containing a general defence of learning, some short epistles, and several tragedies and court masques. And he wrote, besides in prose, a history of England from the conquest to the end of the reign of Edward III, as well as the defence of rhyme in answer to Campion, which has been already mentioned. Very opposite judgments have been passed upon Daniel. Ben Jonson, in his Conversations with Drummond, declared him to be no poet. Drummond, on the contrary, pronounces him for sweetness of rhyming second to none. His style, both in prose and verse, has a remarkably modern air. If it were weeded of a few obsolete expressions, it would scarcely seem more antique than that of Waller, which is the most modern of the 17th century. Bishop Kennet, who has republished Daniel's history after telling us that the author had a place at court in the reign of King James I, being groom of the privy chambers to the Queen, observes that he seems to have taken all the refinement a court could give him, and probably the absence of pedantry in his style and its easy and natural flow are to be traced in great part to the circumstance of his having been a man of the world. His verse, too, always careful and exact, is in many passages more than smooth, even in his dramatic writings, which, having nothing dramatic about them except the form, have been held in very small estimation. It is frequently musical and sweet, though always artificial. The highest quality of his poetry is a tone of quiet, pensive reflection, in which he is fond of indulging, and which often rises to dignity and eloquence, and has at times even something of depth and originality. Daniel's was the not uncommon fate of an attendant upon courts and the great. He is believed to have experienced some neglect from his royal patrons in his latter days, or at least to have been made jealous by Ben Jonson being employed to furnish part of the poetry for the court entertainments, the supply of which he used to have all to himself, upon which he retired to a life of quiet and contemplation in the country. It sounds strange in the present day to be told that his favourite retreat from the gaiety and bustle of London was a house which he rented in Old Street, St. Luke's. In his gardens here, we are informed by the writer of the life prefixed to his collected poems, he would often indulge in entire solitude for many months, or at most receive the visits of only a few select friends. It is said to have been here that he composed most of his dramatic pieces. Towards the end of his life he retired to a farm which he had at Beckington, near Phillips Norton, in Somersetshire, and his death took place there. He was married, says the editor of his works, but whether to the person he so often celebrates under the name of Delia is uncertain. Fuller, in his Worthies, tells us that his wife's name was Justina. They had no children. Daniel is said to have been appointed to the honorary post of poet laureate after the death of Spenser. In his narrative poetry, Daniel is in general wire-drawn, flat, and feeble. He has no passion and very little descriptive power. His Civil Wars has certainly as little of martial animation in it as any poem in the language. There is abundance indeed of the tranquil mind, but of the plumed troops and the rest of the pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war, Daniel seems, in composing this work, we have nearly written in this composing work, to have taken as complete a farewell as Othello himself. It is mostly a tissue of long-winded disquisition and cold and languid declamation, and has altogether more of the qualities of a good opiate than of a good poem. We will therefore take the few extracts for which we can make room from some of his other productions, where his vein of reflection is more in place and also better in itself. His Musophilus is perhaps upon the whole his finest piece. The poem, which is in the form of a dialogue between Philocosmus, a lover of the world, and Musophilus, a lover of the muse, commences thus: Philocosmus, fond man, Musophilus, that thus dost spend in an ungainful art thy dearest days, tiring thy wits and toiling to no end, but to attain that idle smoke of praise. Now when this busy world cannot attend the untimely music of neglected lays, other delights than these, other desires, this wiser profit-seeking age requires. Musophilus, friend Philocosmus, I confess indeed I love this sacred art thou set'st so light, and though it never stand my life instead, it is enough it gives myself delight, the whilst my unafflicted mind doth feed on no unholy thoughts for benefit. Be it that my unseasonable song come out of time, that fault is in the time, and I must not do virtue so much wrong as love her aught the worse for others' crime. And yet I find some blessed spirits among that cherish me, and like in grace my rhyme. Again, that I do more in soul esteem than all the gain of dust the world doth crave, and if I may attain but to redeem my name from dissolution and the grave, I shall have done enough, and better deem to have lived to be than to have died to have. Short-breathed mortality would yet extend that span of life so far forth as it may, and rob her fate, seek to beguile her end, of some few lingering days of afterstay, that all this little all might not descend into the dark and universal prey, and give our labours yet this poor delight, that when our days do end, they are not done. And though we die, we shall not perish quite, but live 2 lives where others have but one. Further on in the dialogue, Musophilus exclaims, so fares this humorous world, that evermore, wrapt with the current of a present course, runs into that which lay contemned before, then glutted leaves the same, and falls to a worse. Now zeal holds all, no life but to adore, then cold in spirit, and life is of no force. Straight all that holy was unhallowed lies, the scattered carcasses of ruined vows. Then truth is false, and now hath blindness eyes. Then zeal trusts all, now scarcely what it knows. That evermore, too foolish or too wise, it fatal is to be seduced with shows. Sacred religion, mother of form and fear, how gorgeously sometimes dost thou sit decked! What pompous vestures do we make thee wear! What stately piles we prodigal erect! How sweet perfumed thou art! How shining clear! How solemnly observed! With what respect! Another time, all plain, all quite threadbare, thou must have all within, and naught without. Sit poorly, without light, disrobed, no care of outward grace, to amuse the poor devout. Powerless, unfollowed, scarcely men can spare the necessary rites to set thee out. Either truth, goodness, virtue are not still the self same which they are, and always one, but altered to the project of our will, or we our actions make them wait upon, putting them in the livery of our skill, and cast them off again when we have done. Afterwards he replies very finely to an objection of Philocosmus to the cultivation of poetry from the small number of those who really cared for it. And for the few that only lend their ear, that few is all the world, which with a few do ever live, and move, and work, and stir. This is the heart doth feel, and only know the rest of all that only bodies bear, roll up and down, and fill up but the row, and serve, as others' members, not their own, the instruments of those that do direct, Then what disgrace is this, not to be known, to those know not to give themselves respect? And though they swell with pomp of folly blown, they live ungraced, and die but in neglect. And for my part, if only one allow the care my labouring spirits take in this, he is to me a theatre large enow, and his applause only sufficient is. All my respect is bent but to his brow, that is my all, and all I am is his. And if some worthy spirits be pleased to, it shall more comfort breed, but not more will. But what if none? It cannot yet undo the love I bear unto this holy skill. This is the thing that I was born to do. This is my scene. This part must I fulfill. Our last extract shall be from his epistle to the Lady Margaret, Countess of Cumberland, the mother of Lady Anne Clifford, afterwards Countess of Pembroke, Dorset, and Montgomery, to whom Daniel had been tutor. He that of such a height hath set his mind, and reared the dwelling of the thoughts so strong, as neither fear nor hope can shake the frame of his resolved powers, nor all the wind of vanity or malice pierce to wrong his subtle peace, or to disturb the same. What a fair seat hath he from whence he may the boundless wastes and wheels of man survey? And with how free an eye doth he look down upon these lower regions of turmoil, where all the storms of passions mainly beat on flesh and blood, where honour, power, renown are only gay affection's golden toil, where greatness stands upon as feeble feet as frailty doth, and only great doth seem to little minds who do it so esteem. Thus, madam, fares that man that hath prepared a rest for his desires, and sees all things beneath him, and hath learned this book of man, full of the notes of frailty, and compared the best of glory with her sufferings, by whom I see you labour all you can to plant your heart and set your thoughts as near his glorious mansion as your powers can bear, which, madam, are so soundly fashioned by that clear judgment that hath carried you beyond the feeble limits of your kind, as they can stand against the strongest head passion can make, inure to any hue the world can cast, that cannot cast that mind out of the form of goodness, that doth see both what the best and worst of earth can be. Which makes that, whatsoever here befalls, you in the region of your self remain, where no vain breath of the impudent molests, that lieth secured within the brazen walls of a clear conscience, that without all stain rises in peace, in innocency rests, whilst all what malice from without procures shows her own ugly heart, but hurts not yours. And whereas none rejoice more in revenge than women used to do, yet you well know that wrong is better checked by being contemned than being pursued, leaving to him to avenge to whom it appertains, wherein you show how worthily your clearness hath condemned base malediction, living in the dark, that at the rays of goodness still doth bark. Knowing the heart of man is set to be the centre of this world, about the which these revolutions of disturbances still roll, where all the aspects of misery predominate, whose strong effects are such as he must bear, being powerless to redress, and that unless above himself he can erect himself, how poor a thing is man. And this note, madame, of your worthiness remains recorded in so many hearts, as time nor malice cannot wrong your right in the inheritance of fame you must possess. You have built, you by your great deserts, out of small means, a far more exquisite and glorious dwelling for your honoured name than all the gold of leaden mines can frame. Drayton. Michael Drayton, who is computed to have been born in 1563 and who died in 1631, is one of the most voluminous of our old poets, being the author, besides many minor compositions, of 3 works of great length: his Baron's Wars, on the subject of the civil wars of the reign of Edward II, originally entitled Mortemeriados, under which name it was published in 1596, his England's Heroical Epistles, 1598, and his Polyolbion, the first 18 books of which appeared in 1612, and the whole consisting of 30 books and extending to as many thousand lines in 1622. This last is the work on which his fame principally rests. It is a most elaborate and minute topographical description of England, written in Alexandrine rhymes, and is a very remarkable work for the varied learning it displays as well as for its poetic merits. The genius of Drayton is neither very imaginative nor very pathetic, but he is an agreeable and weighty writer, with an ardent, if not a highly creative fancy. From the height to which he occasionally ascends, as well as from his power of keeping longer on the wing, he must be ranked, as he always has been, much before both Warner and Daniel. He has greatly more elevation than the former, and more true poetic life than the latter. His most graceful poetry, however, is perhaps to be found in some of his shorter pieces, in his pastorals, his very elegant and little lively poem entitled Nymphidia, or the Court of Fairy, and his verses on poets and poesy, in which occur the lines on Marlowe that have been quoted in the preceding page. From a mass of verse extending in all to not far from 100,000 lines, the few extracts that we can give must be far from affording a complete illustration of the author's genius. The following is from the commencement of the 13th book or song of the Polyolbion, the subject of which is the county of Warwick, of which Drayton, as he here tells us, was a native. Upon the Midlands now the industrious Muse doth fall, that shire which we the heart of England well may call, as she herself extends the midst which is decreed, betwixt St. Michael's Mount and Berwick bordering Tweed. Brave Warwick, that abroad so long advanced her bear, by her illustrious earls renowned everywhere, above her neighbouring shires, which always bore her head. My native country, then, which so brave spirits has bred, if there be virtues yet remaining in thy earth, or any good of thine thou bredst into my birth, accept it as thine own, whilst now I sing of thee, of all thy later brood, the unworthiest though I be. When Phoebus lifts his head out of the water's wave, no sooner doth the earth her flowery bosom brave, at such time as the year brings on the pleasant spring, but hunts up to the morn the feathered sylvans sing. And in the lower grove, as on the rising knoll, upon the highest spray of every mounting pole, these quiristers are perched, with many a speckled breast. Then from her burnished gate the goodly glittering east gilds every mountain top, which late the humorous night bespangled had with pearl, to please the morning's sight. On which the mirthful choirs, with their clear open throats, to the joyful morn so strain their warbling notes, that hills and valleys ring, and even the echoing air seems all composed of sounds about them everywhere. The throstle with shrill sharps, as purposely he song to awake the lustless sung, or chiding that so long he was in coming forth, that should the thickets thrill, the woosel near at hand that hath a golden bill, as nature him had marked of purpose to let us see, that from all other birds his tunes should different be, for with their vocal sounds they sing to pleasant May, upon his dulcet pipe the merle doth only play. When in the lower brake the nightingale hard by, in such lamenting strains the joyful hours doth ply, as though the other birds she to her tunes would draw, and, but that nature by her all constraining law, each bird to her own kind this season doth invite, they else alone to hear that charmer of the night, the more to use their ears their voices sure would spare, that moduleth her notes so admirably rare, as man to set in parts at first had learned of her. To Philomel the next, the linnet we prefer, and by that warbling bird the woodlark place we then, the red sparrow, the nope, the redbreast, and the wren, the yellow pate, which, though she hurt the blooming tree, yet scarce hath any bird a finer pipe than she. And of these chanting fowls, the goldfinch not behind, that hath so many sorts descending from her kind, the tidy, for her notes as delicate as they, the laughing hecco, than the counterfeiting jay. The softer with the shrill, some hid among the leaves, some in the taller trees, some in the lower greaves. Thus sing away the morn, until the mounting sun through thick exhaled fogs his golden head hath run, and through the twisted tops of our close covert creeps, to kiss the gentle shade, this while that sweetly sleeps. And near to these our thicks, the wild and frightful herds, not hearing other noise but this of chattering birds, feed fairly on the lawns, both sorts of seasoned deer. Here walk the stately red, the freckled fallow there. The bucks and lusty stags amongst the rascals strewed, as sometime gallant spirits amongst the multitude. Of all the beasts, which we for our venereal name, the hart among the rest, the hunter's noblest game, of which most princely chase, sith none did e'er report, or by description touch to express that wondrous sport, yet might have well beseemed the ancients' noble songs. To our old Arden here most fitly it belongs. Yet shall she not invoke the Muses to her aid, but thee, Diana bright, a goddess and a maid, in many a huge grown wood, and many a shady grove, which oft hast borne thy bow, great huntress, used to rove at many a cruel beast, and with thy darts to pierce the lion, panther, ounce, the bear, and tiger fierce, and following thy fleet game, chased mighty forest's queen, with thy dishevelled nymphs attired in youthful green, about the lawns hast scoured, and wastes both far and near. Brave huntress! But no beast shall prove thy quarries here, save those the best of chase, the tall and lusty red. The stag, for goodly shape and stateliness of head, is fittest to hunted force. For whom, when with his hounds the labouring hunter tufts the thick unbarbed grounds, where harboured is the hart, there often from his feed the dogs of him do find, or thorough, skilful heed, the huntsman by his shot, or breaking earth, perceives, or entering of the thick, by pressing of the greaves, where he had gone to lodge. Now when the hart doth hear the often bellowing hounds to vent his secret lair, he rousing rusheth out, and through the brakes doth drive, as though up by the roots the bushes he would rive, and through the cumbrous thicks as fearfully he makes, he with his branched head the tender saplings shakes, that sprinkling their moist pearls, do seem for him to weep, when after goes the cry, with yellings, loud and deep, that all the forest rings, and every neighbouring place. And there is not a hound but falleth to the chase, rechading with his horn, which then the hunter cheers, while still the lusty stag his high-palmed head uprears, his body showing state, with unbent knees upright, expressing from all beasts his courage in his flight. But when, the approaching foe still following, he perceives that he his speed must trust, his usual walk he leaves, and o'er the champaign flies, which when the assembly find, each follows as his horse were footed with the wind. But being then embossed, the noble stately deer, when he hath gotten ground, the kennel cast arear, doth beat the brooks and ponds for sweet refreshing soil, that serving not, then proves if he his scent can foil, and makes amongst the herds and flocks of shag-wooled sheep, them frighting from the guard of those who had their keep, but whenas all his shifts his safety still denies, put quite out of his walk the ways and fallows tries, whom when the ploughman meets, his team he letteth stand, to assail him with his goad, so with his hook in hand the shepherd him pursues, and to his dog doth hallo, when with tempestuous speed the hounds and huntsmen follow, until the noble deer, through toil bereaved of strength, his long and sinewy legs then failing him at length, the village's attempts enraged not giving way to anything he meets now at his sad decay. The cruel ravenous hounds and bloody hunters near, this noblest beast of chase, that vainly doth not fear some bank or quickset finds, to which his haunch opposed, he turns upon his foes that soon have him enclosed. The churlish-throated hounds, then holding him at bay, and as their cruel fangs on his harsh skin they lay, with his sharp-pointed head he dealeth deadly wounds. The hunter coming in to help his wearied hounds, he desperately assails, until, oppressed by force, he, who the mourner is to his own dying course, upon the ruthless earth his precious tears lets fall. This passage, though long, will scarcely be felt to be tedious. It is one of the most animated descriptions in poetry. We add a short specimen of Drayton's lighter style from his Nymphidia, the account of the equipage of the Queen of the Fairies, when she set out to visit her lover Pigwiggan. The reader may compare it with Mercutio's description in Romeo and Juliet. Her chariot ready straight is made, each thing therein is fitting laid, that she by nothing might be stayed, for naught must be her letting. 4 nimble guests the horses were, their harnesses of gossamer, fly cranion her charioteer upon the coach-box gidding. Her chariot of a snail's fine shell, which for the colours did excel the fair Queen Mab becoming well, so lively was the limbing. The seat the soft wool of the bee, the cover gallantly to see the wing of a pied butterfly. I trow 'twas simple trimming. The wheels composed of cricket's bones, and daintily made for the nonce, for fear of rattling on the stones, with thistle down they shod it. For all her maidens much did fear, if Oberon had chanced to hear that Mab, his queen, should have been there, he would not have abode it. She mounts her chariot with a trice, nor would she stay for no advice, until her maids, that were so nice to wait on her, were fitted, but ran herself away alone, which when they heard, there was not one, but hasted after to be gone, as she had been diswitted. Hop and mop and drab so clear, pip and trip and skip that we're to Mab their sovereign so dear, her special maids of honour. Fib and Tib and Pink and Pin, Tick and Quick and Jill and Gin, Tit and Knit and Wap and Win, the train that wait upon her. Upon a grasshopper they got, and what with amble and with trot, for hedge nor ditch they spared not, but after her they hie them. A cobweb over them they throw, to shield the wind if it should blow, themselves they wisely could bestow, lest any should espy them. Joseph Hall. Here should not be omitted a name of great note, that of Joseph Hall, who was born in 1574, and was successively Bishop of Exeter and Norwich, from the latter of which sees, having been expelled by the Long Parliament, he died, after protracted sufferings from imprisonment and poverty, in 1656. Hall began his career of authorship by the publication of 3 books of satires in 1597, while he was a student at Cambridge, and only in his 23rd year. A continuation followed the next year under the title of Virgidemiarum. The 3 last books and the whole were afterwards republished together as Virgidemiarum, 6 books, that is, 6 books of bundles of rods. These satires, says Warton, who has given an elaborate analysis of them, are marked with a classical precision to which English poetry had yet hardly attained. They are replete with animation of style and sentiment. The characters are delineated in strong and lively colouring, and their discriminations are touched with the masterly traces of genuine humour. The versification is equally energetic and elegant, and the fabric of the couplets approaches to the modern standard. Hall's satires have been repeatedly reprinted in modern times. End of section 47. Section 48 of a Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1, by George Lillie CRAIK. Chapter 4, Part 24. Sylvester. One of the most popular poets of this date was Joshua Sylvester, the translator of the divine weeks and works and other productions of the French poet Du Bartas. Sylvester has the honour of being supposed to have been one of the early favourites of Milton. In one of his publications he styles himself a merchant adventurer, and he seems to have belonged to the Puritan party, which may have had some share in influencing Milton's regard. His translation of Du Bartas was first published in 1605, and the seventh edition, beyond which we believe its popularity did not carry it, appeared in 1641. Nothing can be more uninspired than the general run of Joshua's verse, or more fantastic and absurd than the greater number of its more ambitious passages, for he had no taste or judgment, and provided the stream of sound and the jingle of the rhyme were kept up, all was right in his notion. His poetry consists chiefly of translations from the French, but he is also the author of some original pieces, the title of one of which, a courtly offering from the poetical Puritan to the prejudices of King James, may be quoted as a lively specimen of his style and genius. Tobacco battered, and the pipes shattered about their ears, that idly idolize so base and barbarous a weed, or at least wise over love so loathsome a vanity, by a volley of holy shot thundered from Mount Helicon. But with all his general flatness and frequent absurdity, Sylvester has an uncommon flow of harmonious words at times, and occasionally even some fine lines and felicitous expressions. His contemporaries called him the silver-tongued Sylvester, for what they considered the sweetness of his versification, and some of his best passages justify the title. Indeed, even when the substance of what he writes approaches nearest to nonsense, the sound is often very graceful, soothing the ear with something like the swing and ring of Dryden's heroics. But after a few lines is always sure to come in some ludicrous image or expression which destroys the effect of the whole. The translation of Du Bartas is inscribed to King James in a most adulatory and elaborate dedication, consisting of a string of sonnet-shaped stanzas, 10 in all, of which the 2 first are a very fair sample of the mingled good and bad of Sylvester's poetry. To England's, Scotland's, France, and Ireland's king, great emperor of Europe's greatest isles, monarch of hearts and arts, and everything beneath boots, many thousand miles, upon whose head honour and fortune smiles, about whose brows clusters of crowns do spring, whose faith him champion of the faith in styles, whose wisdom's fame o'er all the world doth ring, Mnemosyne and her fair daughters bring the Daphnean crown to crown him laureate, whole and sole sovereign of the Thespian spring, prince of Parnassus and Pieria state, and with their crown their kingdom's arms they yield, thrice 3 pens sunlike in a Cynthian field, signed by themselves and their high treasurer, Bartas the Great, engrossed by Sylvester. Our sun did set, and yet no night ensued, our woeful loss so joyful gain did bring, in tears we smile, amid our sighs we sing, so suddenly our dying light renewed. As when the Arabian only bird doth burn her aged body in sweet flames to death, out of her cinders a new bird hath breath, in whom the beauties of the first return, from spicy ashes of the sacred urn of our dead Phoenix, dear Elizabeth. A new true Phoenix lively flourisheth, whom greater glories than the first adorn, So much, O king, thy sacred worth presume I on. James, thou just heir of England's joyful union. It is not to be denied that there is considerable skill in versification here, and also some ingenious rhetoric, but not to notice the pervading extravagance of the sentiment, some of the best sounding of the lines and phrases have next to no meaning, and the close of each stanza, that of the last in particular, is in the manner of a ludicrous travesty. Many of Sylvester's conceits, however, belong to the original upon which he worked, and which, upon the whole, may be considered as fairly represented, perhaps occasionally improved, in his translation. Some passages are very melodiously given, the following, for instance, the commencement of which may put the reader in mind of Milton's "Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn." All hail, pure lamp, bright, sacred, and excelling, sorrow and care, darkness and dread repelling. Thou, world's great taper, wicked men's just terror, mother of truth, true beauty's only mirror, God's eldest daughter, oh, how thou art full of grace and goodness, oh, how beautiful! But yet, because all pleasures wax unpleasant, if without pause we still possess them present, and none can right discern the sweets of peace that have not felt war's irksome bitterness, and swans seem whiter if swart crows be by, for contraries each other best descry. The All's architect alternately decreed that night the day should night succeed. The night, to temper day's exceeding drought, moistens our air, and makes our earth to sprout. The night is she that all our travails eases, buries our cares, and all our griefs appeases. The night is she that with her sable wing, in gloomy darkness hushing everything, through all the world dumb silence doth distil, and wearied bones with quiet sleep doth fill. Sweet night, without thee, alas, our life were loathsome, even a hell to pass. For outward pains and inward passions still, with thousand deaths, would soul and body thrill. O night, thou pullest the proud mask away, wherewith vain actors in this world's great play by day disguise them. For no difference night makes between the peasant and the prince, the poor and rich, the prisoner and the judge, the foul and fair, the master and the drudge, the fool and wise, barbarian and the Greek, for night's black mantle covers all alike. He that, condemned for some notorious vice, seeks in the mines the baits of avarice, or melting at the furnace findeth bright our soul's dire sulphur, resteth yet at night. He that still stooping tugs against the tide his laden barge alongst a river's side, and filling shores with shouts doth melt him quite upon his pallet, resteth yet at night. He that in summer, in extremest heat, scorched all day in his own scalding sweat, shaves with keen scythe the glory and delight of motley meadows, resteth yet at night, and in the arms of his dear sphere foregoes all former troubles and all former woes. Only the learned sister's sacred minions, while silent night under her sable pinions folds all the world, with painless pain they tread a sacred path that to the heavens doth lead, and higher than the heavens their readers raise upon the wings of their immortal lays. Chapman's Homer. Of the translators from the ancients in this age, by far the greatest is Chapman. George Chapman was born at Hitching Hill in the county of Hertford in 1557, and lived till 1634. Besides his plays, which will be afterwards noticed, he is the author of several original poetical pieces, but he is best and most favourably known by his versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He would have made a great epic poet, Charles Lamb has said, in his Specimens of the English Dramatic Poets, turning to these works after having characterized his dramas. if indeed he has not abundantly shown himself to be one, for his Homer is not so properly a translation as the stories of Achilles and Ulysses rewritten. The earnestness and passion which he has put into every part of these poems would be incredible to a reader of mere modern translations. His almost Greek zeal for the honour of his heroes is only paralleled by that fierce spirit of Hebrew bigotry with which Milton, as if personating one of the zealots of the old law, clothed himself when he sat down to paint the acts of Samson against the uncircumcised. The great obstacle to Chapman's translations being read is their unconquerable quaintness. He pours out in the same breath the most just and natural and the most violent and forced expressions. He seems to grasp whatever words come first to hand during the impetus of inspiration, as if all other must be inadequate to the divine meaning. But passion, the all in all in poetry, is everywhere present, raising the low, dignifying the mean, and putting sense into the absurd. He makes his readers glow, weep, tremble, take any affection which he pleases, be moved by words or in spite of them, be disgusted and overcome that disgust. Chapman's Homer is, in some respects, not unworthy of this enthusiastic tribute. Few writers have been more copiously inspired with the genuine frenzy of poetry, with that fine madness which, as Drayton has said in his lines on Marlowe, rightly should possess a poet's brain. Indeed, in the character of his genius, out of the province of the drama, Chapman bears a considerable resemblance to Marlowe, whose unfinished translation of Musaeus's Hero and Leander he completed. With more judgment and more care he might have given to his native language in his version of the Iliad one of the very greatest of the poetical works it possesses. But what, except the most extreme irregularity and inequality, a rough sketch rather than a finished performance, was to be expected from his boast of having translated half the poem, namely the last 12 books, in 15 weeks? Yet rude and negligent upon the whole as it is, Chapman's is by far the most Homeric Iliad we yet possess. The enthusiasm of the translator for his original is uncompromising to a degree of the ludicrous. Of all books, he exclaims in his preface, extant in all kinds, Homer is the first and best. And in the same spirit, in quoting a passage from Pliny's Natural History in another portion of his preliminary matter, he proceeds first to turn it into verse, that no prose may come near Homer. In spite, however, of all this eccentricity, and of a hurry and impetuosity which betray him into many mistranslations, and on the whole have the effect perhaps of giving a somewhat too tumultuous and stormy representation of the Homeric poetry, the English into which Chapman transfuses the meaning of the mighty ancient is often singularly and delicately beautiful. He is the author of nearly all the happiest of the compound epithets which Pope has adopted, and of many others equally musical and expressive. Far-shooting Phoebus, the ever-living gods, the many-headed hill, the ivory-wristed queen, are a few of the felicitous combinations with which he has enriched his native tongue. Carelessly executed indeed as the work for the most part is, there is scarcely a page of it that is not irradiated by gleams of the truest poetic genius. Often in the midst of a long paragraph of the most chaotic versification, the fatigued and distressed ear is surprised by a few lines, or maybe sometimes only a single line, musical as is Apollo's lute, and sweet and graceful enough to compensate for 10 times as much ruggedness. Such, for instance, is the following version of part of the description of the visit paid by Ulysses and his companions to the shrine of Apollo at Chrysa in the first book. The youths crowned cups of wine, drank off, and filled again to all. That day was held divine, and spent in paeans to the sun, who heard with pleased ear, when whose bright chariot stooped to sea, and twilight hid the clear, all soundly on their cable slept, even till the night was worn. And when the Lady of the Light, the rosy-fingered Morn, rose from the hills, all fresh arose, and to the camp retired, while Phoebus with a foreright wind their swelling bark inspired. And here are a few more verses steeped in the same liquid beauty, from the catalogue of the ships in the second book, who dwell in Pylos' sandy soil, and Arene the fair, in Thyron near Alpheus' flood, and Ephe full of air. In Cyparisseis, Amphigen, and little Telion, the town where all the Eliots dwell, and famous Dorion, where all the Muses, opposite in strife of poesy, to ancient Thamyris of Thrace did use him cruelly. He coming from Eurytus' court, the wise Oechalian king, because he proudly durst affirm he could more sweetly sing than that Pyrian race of Jove, they, angry with his vaunt, bereft his eyesight and his song, that did the ear enchant. And of his skill to touch his harp, disfurnished his hand, all these in 90 hollow keels grave Nestor did command. Almost the whole of this second book, indeed, is admirably translated. In the harangues, particularly of Agamemnon and the other generals in the earlier part of it, all the fire of Homer burns and blazes in English verse. Harington, Fairfax, Fanshawe. Of the translators of foreign poetry which belong to this period, 3 are very eminent. Sir John Harington's translation of the Orlando Furioso first appeared in 1591, when the author was in his 30th year. It does not convey all the glow and poetry of Ariosto, but it is nevertheless a performance of great ingenuity and talent. The translation of Tasso's great epic by Edward Fairfax was first published under the title of Godfrey of Boulogne, or the Recovery of Jerusalem, in 1600. This is a work of true genius, full of passages of great beauty, and although by no means a perfectly exact or servile version of the Italian original, is throughout executed with as much care as taste and spirit. Sir Richard Fanshawe is the author of versions of Camion's Lusiad, of Guerrarini's Pastor Fido, of the fourth book of the Aeneid, of the Odes of Horace, and of the Querer por solo querer, to love for love's sake, of the Spanish dramatist Mendoza. Some passages from the last mentioned work, which was published in 1649, may be found in Lamb's Specimens, the ease and flowing gaiety of which never have been excelled even in original writing. The Pastor Fido is also rendered with much spirit and elegance. Fanshawe is, besides, the author of a Latin translation of Fletcher's Faithful Shepherdess, and of some original poetry. His genius, however, was sprightly and elegant, rather than lofty, and perhaps he does not succeed so well in translating poetry of a more serious style. At least Mickle, the modern translator of Camion's, in the discourse prefixed to his own version, speaks with great contempt of that of his predecessor, affirming not only that it is exceedingly unfaithful, but that Fanshawe had not the least idea of the dignity of the epic style, or of the true spirit of poetical translation. He seems also to sneer at Fanshawe's Lusiad, because it was published during the usurpation of Cromwell, as if even the poets and translators of that time must have been a sort of illegitimates and usurpers in their way. But Fanshawe was all his life a steady royalist, and served both Charles I. and his son in a succession of high employments. Mickle, in truth, was not the man to appreciate either Fanshawe or Cromwell. Drummond. One of the most graceful poetical writers of the reign of James I. is William Drummond, of Hawthornden, near Edinburgh, and he is further deserving of notice as the first of his countrymen, at least of any eminence, who aspired to write in English. He has left us a quantity of prose as well as verse. the former very much resembling the style of Sir Philip Sidney in his Arcadia; the latter, in manner and spirit, formed more upon the model of Surrey, or rather upon that of Petrarch and the other Italian poets, whom Surrey and many of his English successors imitated. No early English imitator of the Italian poetry, however, has excelled Drummond, either in the sustained melody of his verse, or its rich vein of thoughtful tenderness. We will transcribe one of his sonnets as a specimen of the fine moral painting, tinged with the colouring of scholarly recollections, in which he delights to indulge. Trust not, sweet soul, those curled waves of gold, with gentle tides that on your temples flow, nor temples spread with flakes of virgin snow, nor snow of cheeks with Tyrian grain enrolled. Trust not those shining lights which wrought my woe, when first I did their azure rays behold; nor voice whose sounds more strange effects do show than of the Thracian harper have been told. Look to this dying lily, fading rose, dark hyacinth, of late whose blushing beams made all the neighbouring herbs and grass rejoice, and think how little is twixt life's extremes. The cruel tyrant that did kill those flowers shall once me not spare that spring of yours. Davies. A remarkable poem of this age, first published in 1599, is the Nasce Typsum of Sir John Davies, who was successively Solicitor and Attorney General in the reign of James, and had been appointed to the place of Chief Justice of the King's Bench when he died, before he could enter upon its duties in 1626. Davies is also the author of a poem on dancing, entitled Orchestra, and of some minor pieces, all distinguished by vivacity as well as precision of style. But he is only now remembered for his philosophical poem, the earliest of the kind in the language. It is written in rhyme, in the common heroic 10-syllable verse, but disposed in quatrains, like the early play of Misogynist already mentioned, and other poetry of the same era, or like Sir Thomas Overbury's poem of the Wife, the Gondibert of Sir William Devenant, and the Annus Mirabilis of Drayton at a later period. No one of these writers has managed this difficult stanza so successfully as Davies. It has the disadvantage of requiring the sense to be in general closed at certain regularly and quickly recurring turns, which yet are very ill adapted for an effective pause; and even all the skill of Dryden has been unable to free it from a certain air of monotony and languor, a circumstance of which that poet may be supposed to have been himself sensible, since he wholly abandoned it after one or two early attempts. Davies, however, has conquered its difficulties, and, as has been observed, perhaps no language can produce a poem extending to so great a length of more condensation of thought, or in which fewer languid verses will be found. In fact, it is by this condensation and sententious brevity, so carefully filed and elaborated, however, as to involve no sacrifice of perspicuity or fullness of expression, that he has attained his end. Every quatrain is a pointed expression of a separate thought, like one of Rochefoucauld's maxims, each thought being, by great skill and painstaking in the packing, made exactly to fit and to fill the same case. It may be doubted, however, whether Davies would not have produced a still better poem if he had chosen a measure which would have allowed him greater freedom and real variety; unless, indeed, his poetical talent was of a sort that required the suggestive aid and guidance of such artificial restraints as he had to cope with in this; and what would have been a bondage to a more fiery and teeming imagination was rather a support to his. He wrote, among other things, a number of acrostics upon the name of Queen Elizabeth, which, says Ellis, are probably the best acrostics ever written, and all equally good, but they seem to prove that their author was too fond of struggling with useless difficulties. Perhaps he found the limitations of the acrostic too a help rather than a hindrance. Donne. The title of the metaphysical school of poetry, which in one sense of the words might have been given to Davies and his imitators, has been conferred by Dryden upon another race of writers, whose founder was a contemporary of Davies, the famous Dr. John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's. Donne, who died at the age of 58 in 1631, is said to have written most of his poetry before the end of the 16th century, but none of it was published till late in the reign of James. It consists of lyrical pieces entitled Songs and Sonnets, epithalamiums or marriage songs, funeral and other elegies, satires, epistles, and divine poems. On a superficial inspection, Donne's verses look like so many riddles. They seem to be written upon the principle of making the meaning as difficult to be found out as possible, of using all the resources of language, not to express thought, but to conceal it. Nothing is said in a direct, natural manner. Conceit follows conceit without intermission. The most remote analogies, the most far-fetched images, the most unexpected turns, one after another, surprise and often puzzle the understanding. While things of the most opposite kinds, the harsh and the harmonious, the graceful and the grotesque, the grave and the gay, the pious and the profane, meet and mingle in the strangest of dances. But running through all this bewilderment, a deeper insight detects not only a vein of the most exuberant wit, but often the sunniest and most delicate fancy, and the truest tenderness and depth of feeling. Donne, though in the latter part of his life he became a very serious and devout poet as well as man, began by writing amatory lyrics, the strain of which is anything rather than devout, and in this kind of writing he seems to have formed his poetic style, which for such compositions would, to a mind like his, be the most natural and expressive of any. The species of lunacy which quickens and exalts the imagination of a lover would, in one of so seething a brain as he was, strive to expend itself in all sorts of novel and wayward combinations, just as Shakespeare has made it do in his Romeo and Juliet, whose rich intoxication of spirit he has by nothing else set so livingly before us as by making them thus exhaust all the eccentricities of language in their struggle to give expression to that inexpressible passion which had taken captive the whole heart and being of both. Donne's later poetry, in addition to the same abundance and originality of thought, often running into a wildness and extravagance not so excusable here as in his erotic verses, is famous for the singular movement of the versification, which has been usually described as the extreme degree of the rugged and tuneless. Pope has given us a translation of his 4 satires into modern language, which he calls the Satires of Dr. Donne versified. Their harshness, as contrasted with the music of his lyrics, has also been referred to as proving that the English language at the time when Donne wrote had not been brought to a sufficiently advanced state for the writing of heroic verse in perfection. That this last notion is wholly unfounded, numerous examples sufficiently testify. Not to speak of the blank verse of the dramatists, the rhymed heroics of Shakespeare, of Fletcher, of Jonson, of Spenser, and of other writers contemporary with and of earlier date than Donne, are, for the most part, as perfectly smooth and regular as any that have since been written. At all events, whatever irregularity may be detected in them, if they be tested by Pope's narrow gamut, is clearly not to be imputed to any immaturity in the language. These writers evidently preferred and cultivated deliberately and on principle a wider compass and freer and more varied flow of melody than Pope had a taste or an ear for. Nor can it be questioned, we think, that the peculiar construction of Donne's verse in his satires and many of his other later poems was also adopted by choice and on system. His lines, though they will not suit the seesaw style of reading verse, to which he probably intended that they should be invincibly impracticable, are not without a deep and subtle music of their own, in which the cadences respond to the sentiment, when enunciated with a true feeling of all that they convey. They are not smooth or luscious verses, certainly, nor is it contended that the endeavour to raise them to as vigorous and impressive a tone as possible, by depriving them of all over-sweetness or liquidity, has not been carried too far. But we cannot doubt that whatever harshness they have was designedly given to them, and was conceived to infuse into them an essential part of their relish. Here is one of Donne's songs: Sweetest love, I do not go for weariness of thee, nor in hope the world can show a fitter love for me. But since that I must die at last, 'tis best that to use myself in jest, by feigned death to die. Yesternight the sun went hence, and yet is here to-day. He hath no desire nor sense, nor half so short a way. Then fear not me, but believe that I shall make hastier journey since I take more wings and spurs than he. Oh, how feeble is man's power, that if good fortune fall, cannot add another hour, nor a lost hour recall. But come bad chance, and we join to it our strength, and we teach it art and length, it's for us to advance. When thou sighest not wind, but sighest my soul away. When thou weepst, unkindly kind, my life's blood doth decay. It cannot be that thou lov'st me as thou sayest, if in thine my life thou waste, which art the life of me. Let not thy divining heart forethink me any ill. Destiny may take thy part, and may thy fills fulfill. But think that we are but laid aside to sleep. They who one another keep, alive ne'er parted be. Somewhat fantastic as this may be thought, it is surely notwithstanding full of feeling, and nothing can be more delicate than the execution. Nor is it possible that the writer of such verses can have wanted an ear for melody, however capriciously he may have sometimes experimented upon language, in the effort, as we conceive, to bring a deeper, more expressive music out of it than it would readily yield. We add one of his elegies as a specimen of his more elaborate style. Language, thou art too narrow and too weak to ease us now. Great sorrows cannot speak. If we could sigh our accents, and weep words, grief wears and lessens that tears breath affords. Sad hearts, the less they seem, the more they are. So guiltiest men stand mutest at the bar. Not that they know not, feel not their estate, but extreme sense has made them desperate. Sorrow, to whom we owe all that we be, tyrant in the fifth and greatest monarchy, was't that she did possess all hearts before thou hast killed her, to make thy empire more? Knewest thou some would that knew her not lament, as in a deluge perish the innocent? Was not enough to have that palace won, but thou must raise it too, that was undone? Hadst thou stayed there, and looked out at her eyes, all had adored thee, that now from thee flies. For they let out more light than they took in. They told not when, but did the day begin. She was too sapphirine and clear for thee. Clay, flint, and jet now thy fit dwellings be. Alas, she was too pure, but not too weak. Whoe'er saw crystal ordnance, but would break. And if we be thy conquest, by her fall thou hast lost thy end. In her we perish all. Or if we live but to rebel, that know her better now, who knew her well. If we should vapour out, and pine and die, since she first went, that were not misery. She changed our world with hers. Now she is gone, mirth and prosperity is oppression. For of all moral virtues she was all that ethics speak of virtue's cardinal. Her soul was paradise, the cherubim set to keep it was grace, that kept out sin. She had no more than let in death, for we all reap consumption from one fruitful tree. God took her hence lest some of us should love her like that plant him and his laws above. And when we tears he mercy shed in this, to raise our minds to heaven, where now she is, who, if her virtues would have let her stay, we had had a saint, have now a holiday. Her heart was that strange bush, where sacred fire religion did not consume, but inspire such piety, so chaste use of God's day, that what we turned to feast she turned to pray, and did prefigure here in devout taste the rest of her high Sabbath, which shall last. Angels did hand her up, who next God dwell, for she was of that order whence most fell. Her body's left with us, lest some had said she could not die except they saw her dead. For from less virtue and less beauteousness the Gentiles framed them gods and goddesses. The ravenous earth that now woos her to be earth too will be a lemnia, and the tree that wraps that crystal in a wooden round shall be took up, spruce filled with diamond, and we, her sad glad friends, all bear a part of grief, for all would break a Stoic's heart. End of section 48. Section 49 of a Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1, by George Lillie, CRAIK. Chapter 4, Part 25. Shakespeare's Minor Poems. In the long list of the minor names of the Elizabethan poetry appears the bright name of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare published his Venus and Adonis in 1593 and his Tarquin and Lucrece in 1594. His Passionate Pilgrim did not appear till 1599, the sonnets not till 1609. It is probable, however, that the first mentioned of these pieces, which in his dedication of it to the Earl of Southampton he calls the first heir of his invention, was written some years before its publication. And although the Tarquin and Lucrece may have been published immediately after it was composed, it too may be accounted an early production. We have no positive evidence that any wholly original drama, such as would be considered a work of invention, had yet been produced by Shakespeare, and notwithstanding the force of some of the reasons which have been lately urged for carrying back some of his original plays to a date preceding the year 1593, we are still inclined to think it probable that all the other poetry we have of Shakespeare's was composed at least before he had fairly given himself up to dramatic poetry, or had done anything in that line to which he could properly set his name, or by which he could hope that he would live and be remembered among the poets of his country. But although this minor poetry of Shakespeare sounds throughout like the utterance of that spirit of highest invention and sweetest song before it had found its proper theme, much is here also, immature as it may be, that is still all Shakespearean. The vivid conception, the inexhaustible fertility and richness of thought and imagery, the glowing passion, the gentleness with all that is ever of the poetry as it was of the man, the enamoured sense of beauty, the living words, the ear delighting and heart enthralling music, nay, even the dramatic instinct itself, and the idea, at least, if not always, the realization of that sentiment of all subordinating and consummating art of which his dramas are the most wonderful exemplification in literature. Resuming now the history of that dramatic poetry which is the chief glory of the Elizabethan age of our literature, we begin with a notice of these productions, which constitute by much the most valuable part of it. Shakespeare's dramatic works. William Shakespeare, born in 1564, is enumerated as one of the proprietors of the Blackfriars Theatre in 1589. He is sneered at by Robert Greene in 1592 in terms which seem to imply that he had already acquired a considerable reputation as a dramatist and a writer in blank verse, though the satirist insinuates that he was enabled to make the show he did chiefly by the plunder of his predecessors. And in 1598 he is spoken of by a critic of the day as indisputably the greatest of English dramatists, both for tragedy and comedy, and as having already produced his Two Gentlemen of Verona, Comedy of Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, Love's Labour's Won, generally supposed to be All's Well that Ends Well, Midsummer Night's Dream, Merchant of Venice, Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and Romeo and Juliet. There is no ground, however, for feeling assured, and indeed it is rather improbable, that we have here a complete catalogue of the plays written by Shakespeare up to this date, nor is the authority of so evidently loose a statement embodying, it is to be supposed, the mere report of the town, sufficient even to establish absolutely the authenticity of every one of the plays enumerated. It is very possible, for example, that Meres may be mistaken in assigning Titus Andronicus to Shakespeare, and on the other hand he may be the author of Pericles, and may have already written that play and some others, although Meres does not mention them. The only other direct or positive information we possess on this subject is that a history called Titus Andronicus, presumed to be the play afterwards published as Shakespeare's, was entered for publication at Stationers' Hall in 1593, that the second part of Henry VI if it is by Shakespeare in its original form of the first part of the contention betwixt the two famous houses of York and Lancaster, was published in 1594, the third part of Henry VI, if by Shakespeare in its original form of the true tragedy of Richard, Duke of York, in 1595, is Richard II, Richard III, and Romeo and Juliet in 1597. Love's Labours Lost in the first part of Henry IV in 1598, the latter, however, having been entered at Stationers' Hall the preceding year. A corrected and augmented edition of Romeo and Juliet in 1599. Titus Andronicus, supposing it to be Shakespeare's, the second part of Henry IV, Henry V, in its original form, The Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, and The Merchant of Venice in 1600, the last having been entered at Stationers' Hall in 1598. The Merry Wives of Windsor in its original form in 1602, but entered at Stationers' Hall the year before. Hamlet in 1603, entered likewise the year before. A second edition of Hamlet, enlarged to almost as much again as it was according to the true and perfect copy, in 1604. Lear in 1608, and Troilus and Cressida and Pericles in 1609, each being entered the preceding year. Othello not till 1622, 6 years after the author's death, and all the other plays, namely The Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Winter's Tale, The Comedy of Errors, King John, All's Well that Ends Well, As You Like It, King Henry VIII, Measure for Measure, Cymbeline, Macbeth, The Taming of the Shrew, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens, The Tempest, Twelfth Night, the first part of Henry VI, if Shakespeare had anything to do with that play, and also the perfect editions of Henry V, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and the second and third parts of Henry VI, not, so far as is known, till they appear along with those formerly printed in the first folio in 1623. Such then is the sum of the treasure that Shakespeare has left us. But the revolution which his genius wrought upon our national drama is placed in the clearest light by comparing his earliest plays with the best which the language possessed before his time. He has made all his predecessors obsolete, while his Merchant of Venice and his Midsummer Night's Dream and his Romeo and Juliet and his King John and his Richard II and his Henry IV and his Richard III, all certainly produced, as we have seen, before the year 1598, are still the most universally familiar compositions in our literature. No other dramatic work that had then been written is now popularly read or familiar to anybody except to a few professed investigators of the antiquities of our poetry. Where are now the best productions even of such writers as Greene and Peele and Marlowe and Dekker and Marston and Webster and Thomas Heywood and Middleton? They are to be found among our select collections of old plays, publications intended rather for the mere preservation of the pieces contained in them than for their diffusion among a multitude of readers. Or if the entire works of a few of these elder dramatists have recently been collected and republished, this has still been done only to meet the demand of a comparatively very small number of curious students anxious to possess and examine for themselves whatever relics are still recoverable of the old world of our literature. Popularly known and read the works of these writers never again will be. There is no more prospect or probability of this than there is that the plays of Shakespeare will ever lose their popularity among his countrymen. In that sense, everlasting oblivion is their portion, as everlasting life is his. In one form only have they any chance of again attracting some measure of the general attention, namely, in the form of such partial and very limited exhibition as Lamb has given us an example of in his Specimens. And herein we see the first great difference between the plays of Shakespeare and those of his predecessors, and one of the most immediately conspicuous of the improvements which he introduced into dramatic writing. He did not create our regular drama, but he regenerated and wholly transformed it, as if by breathing into it a new soul. We possess no dramatic production anterior to his appearance that is at once a work of high genius and of anything like equably sustained power throughout. Very brilliant flights of poetry there are in many of the pieces of our earlier dramatists, but the higher they soar in one scene, the lower they generally seem to think it expedient to sink in the next. Their great efforts are made only by fits and starts. For the most part, it must be confessed that the best of them are either merely extravagant and absurd, or do nothing but trifle or doze away over their task with the expenditure of hardly any kind of faculty at all. This may have arisen in part from their own want of judgment or want of painstaking, in part from the demands of a very rude condition of the popular taste, but the effect is to invest all that they have bequeathed to us with an air of barbarism, and to tempt us to take their finest displays of successful daring for mere capricious inspirations, resembling the sudden impulses of fury by which the listless and indolent man of the woods will sometimes be roused for the instant from his habitual laziness and passiveness to an exhibition of superhuman strength and activity. From this savage or savage-looking state our drama was first redeemed by Shakespeare. Even Milton has spoken of his wood notes wild, and Thomson more unceremoniously has baptized him Wild Shakespeare, as if a sort of half-insane irregularity of genius were the quality that chiefly distinguished him from other great writers. If he be a wild writer, it is in comparison with some dramatists and poets of succeeding times who, it must be admitted, are sufficiently tame, compared with the dramatists of his own age and of the age immediately preceding, with the general throng of the writers from among whom he emerged, and the coruscations of whose feebler and more desultory genius he has made pale. He is distinguished from them by nothing which is more visible at the first glance than by the superior regularity and elaboration that mark his productions. Marlowe and Greene and Kidd may be called wild and wayward and careless, but the epithets are inapplicable to Shakespeare, by whom, in truth, it was that the rudeness of our early drama was first refined, and a spirit of high art put into it, which gave it order and symmetry as well as elevation. It was the union of the most consummate judgment with the highest creative power that made Shakespeare the miracle that he was. If indeed we ought not rather to say that such an endowment as his of the poetical faculty necessarily implied the clearest and truest discernment as well as the utmost productive energy, even as the most intense heat must illuminate as well as warm. But undoubtedly his dramas are distinguished from those of his predecessors by much more than merely this superiority in the general principles upon which they are constructed. Such rare passages of exquisite poetry and scenes of sublimity or true passion as sometimes brighten the dreary waste of their productions are equalled or excelled in almost every page of his. The highest heaven of invention to which they ascend only in far distant flights, and where their strength of pinion never sustains them long, is the familiar home of his genius. Other qualities, again, which charm us in his plays are nearly unknown in theirs. He first informed our drama with true wit and humour. Of boisterous, uproarious, blackguard merriment and buffoonery there is no want in our earlier dramatists, nor of mere gibing and jeering and vulgar personal satire, but of true airy wit there is little or none. In the comedies of Shakespeare the wit plays and dazzles like dancing light. This seems to have been the excellence indeed for which he was most admired by his contemporaries. For quickness and felicity of repartee they placed him above all other play-writers. But his humour was still more his own than his wit, in that rich but delicate and subtle spirit of drollery, moistening and softening whatever it touches like a gentle oil, and penetrating through all enfoldings and rigorous encrustments into the kernel of the ludicrous that is in everything, which mainly created Malvolio and Shallow and Slender and Dogberry and Vergus and Bottom and Lancelot and Launce and Costard and Touchstone and a score of other clowns, fools, and simpletons, and which, gloriously overflowing in Falstaff, makes his wit exhilarate like wine. Shakespeare has had almost as few successors as he had predecessors. And in these and all his other delineations he has, like every other great poet or artist, not merely observed and described, but, as we have said, created or invented. It is often laid down that the drama should be a faithful picture or representation of real life, or if this doctrine be given up in regard to the tragic or more impassioned drama, because even kings and queens and the actual world never do declaim in the pomp of blank verse as they do on the stage, still it is insisted that in comedy no character is admissible that is not a transcript, a little embellished perhaps, but still substantially a transcript from some genuine flesh and blood original. But Shakespeare has shown that it belongs to such an imagination as his to create in comedy as well as in tragedy or in poetry of any other kind. Most of the characters that have just been mentioned are as truly the mere creations of the poet's brain as are Ariel or Caliban or the witches in Macbeth. If any modern critic will have it that Shakespeare must have actually seen Malvolio and Launce and Touchstone before he could, or at least would have drawn them, we would ask the said critic if he himself has ever seen such characters in real life, and if he acknowledge, as he needs must, that he never has, we would then put it to him to tell us why the contemporaries of the great dramatist might not have enjoyed them in his plays without ever having seen them elsewhere, just as we do, or in other words, why such delineations might not have perfectly fulfilled their dramatic purpose then as well as now, when they certainly do not represent anything that is to be seen upon earth any more than do Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. There might have been professional clowns and fools in the age of Shakespeare, such as are no longer extant, but at no time did there ever actually exist such fools and clowns as his. These and other similar personages of the Shakespearean drama are as much mere poetical phantasmata as are the creations of the kindred humour of Cervantes. Are they the less amusing or interesting, however, on that account? Do we the less sympathize with them? Nay, do we feel that they are the less naturally drawn, that they have for us less of a truth in life than the most faithful copies from the men and women of the real world? But in the region of reality, too, there is no other drama so rich as that of Shakespeare. He has exhausted the old world of our actual experience, as well as imagined for us new worlds of his own. What other anatomist of the human heart has searched its hidden core, and laid bare all the strength and weakness of our mysterious nature, as he has done in the gushing tenderness of Juliet, and the fine frenzy of the discrowned Lear, and the sublime melancholy of Hamlet, and the wrath of the perplexed and tempest-torn Othello, and the eloquent misanthropy of Timon, and the fixed hate of Shylock? What other poetry has given shape to anything half so terrific as Lady Macbeth, or so winning as Rosalind, or so full of gentlest womanhood as Desdemona? In what other drama do we behold so living a humanity as in his? Who has given us a scene either so crowded with diversities of character, or so stirred with the heat and hurry of actual existence? The men and the manners of all countries and of all ages are there. The lovers and warriors, the priests and prophetesses of the old heroic and kingly times of Greece, the Athenians of the days of Pericles and Alcibiades, the proud patricians and turbulent commonalty of the earliest period of republican Rome, Caesar and Brutus and Cassius and Antony and Cleopatra, and the other splendid figures of that later Roman scene, the kings and queens and princes and courtiers of barbaric Denmark and Roman Britain, and Britain before the Romans, those of Scotland in the time of the English Heptarchy, those of England and France at the era of Magna Carta, all ranks of the people of almost every reign of our subsequent history, from the end of the 14th to the middle of the 16th century, not to speak of Venice and Verona and Mantua and Padua and Illyria and Navarre and the Forest of Arden, and all the other towns and lands which he has peopled for us with their most real inhabitants. Nor even in his plays is Shakespeare merely a dramatist, apart altogether from his dramatic power. He is the greatest poet that ever lived. His sympathy is the most universal, his imagination the most plastic, his diction the most expressive ever given to any writer. His poetry has in itself the power and varied excellences of all other poetry. While in grandeur and beauty and passion and sweetest music and all the other higher gifts of song, he may be ranked with the greatest, with Spenser and Chaucer and Milton and Dante and Homer. He is at the same time more nervous than Dryden, and more sententious than Pope, and more sparkling of more abounding conceit when he chooses than Donne or Cowley or Butler. In whose handling was language ever such a flame of fire as it is in his? His wonderful potency in the use of this instrument would alone set him above all other writers. Language has been called the costume of thought. It is such a costume as leaves are to the tree, or blossoms to the flower, and grows out of what it adorns. Every great and original writer, accordingly, has distinguished, and as it were individualized, himself as much by his diction as by even the sentiment which it embodies, and the invention of such a distinguishing style is one of the most unequivocal evidences of genius. But Shakespeare has invented 20 styles. He has a style for every one of his great characters, by which that character is distinguished from every other, as much as Pope is distinguished by his style from Dryden, or Milton from Spenser. Yet all the while it is he himself, with his own peculiar accent, that we hear in every one of them. The style or manner of expression, that is to say, and if the manner of expression, then also the manner of thinking, of which the expression is always the product, is at once both that which belongs to the particular character, and that which is equally natural to the poet, the conceiver and creator of the character. This double individuality, or combination of two individualities, is inherent of necessity in all dramatic writing. It is what distinguishes the imaginative here from the literal, the artistic from the real, a scene of a play from a police report. No more in this than in any other kind of literature, properly so called, can we dispense with that infusion of the mind from which the work has proceeded, of something belonging to that mind and to no other, which is the very life or constituent principle of all art, the one thing that makes the difference between a creation and a copy, between the poetical and the mechanical. End of section 49. Section 50 of a Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1, by George Lillie, CRAIK. Chapter 4, Part 26. Chapman, Webster, Middleton, Dekker, Chettle, Marston, Tailor, Tourneur, Rowley, Thomas, Heywood. Shakespeare died in 1616, the space of a quarter of a century or more, over which his career as a writer for the stage extends, is illustrated also by the names of a crowd of other dramatists, many of them of very remarkable genius, but Shakespeare is distinguished from the greater number of his contemporaries nearly as much as he is from his immediate predecessors. With regard to the latter, it has been well observed by a critic of eminent justness and delicacy of taste, that while they possessed great power over the passions, had a deep insight into the darkest depths of human nature, and were, moreover, in the highest sense of the word, poets of that higher power of creation with which Shakespeare was endowed, and by which he was enabled to call up into vivid existence all the various characters of men and all the events of human life. Marlowe and his contemporaries had no great share, so that their best dramas may be said to represent to us only gleams and shadowings of mind, confused and hurried actions, from which we are rather led to guess at the nature of the persons acting before us, than instantaneously struck with a perfect knowledge of it. And even amid their highest efforts, with them the fictions of the drama are felt to be but faint semblances of reality. If we seek for a poetical image, a burst of passion, a beautiful sentiment, a trait of nature, we seek not in vain in the works of our very oldest dramatists. But none of the predecessors of Shakespeare must be thought of along with him when he appears before us like Prometheus, moulding the figures of men, and breathing into them the animation and all the passions of life. The same, proceeds this writer, may be said of almost all his illustrious contemporaries. Few of them ever have conceived a consistent character, and given a perfect drawing and colouring of it. They have rarely indeed inspired us with such belief in the existence of their personages as we often feel towards those of Shakespeare, and which makes us actually unhappy unless we can fully understand everything about them, so like are they to living men. The plans of their dramas are irregular and confused, their characters often wildly distorted, and an air of imperfection and incompleteness hangs in general over the whole composition, so that the attention is wearied out, the interest flags, and we rather hurry on than are hurried to the horrors of the final catastrophe. In other words, the generality of the dramatic writers who were contemporary with Shakespeare still belong to the semi-barbarous school which subsisted before he began to write. George Chapman, already mentioned as the translator of Homer, was born 6 or 7 years before Shakespeare, but did not begin to write for the stage till about the year 1595, after which date he produced 16 plays that have survived, besides one in the composition of which he was assisted by Ben Jonson and Marston, and 2 others in which he and Shirley joined. One anonymous play, The Second Maiden's Tragedy, printed for the first time in 1824, and 5 others that are lost have also been attributed to him. All these pieces were probably produced before the year 1620, although he lived till 1634. Chapman's best known, and probably also his best plays, are his tragedy of Bussy d'Amboise, reprinted in the 3rd volume of Dilke's Old Plays, 1814, his comedy of Monsieur d'Olive in the same collection, and his comedies of All Fools, The Widow's Tears, and Eastward Ho!, the last the piece in which he was assisted by Jonson and Marston, in Dodsley's collection. Of all the English playwriters, says Lamb, Chapman perhaps approaches nearest to Shakespeare in the descriptive and didactic, in passages which are less purely dramatic. Dramatic imitation was not his talent. He could not go out of himself, as Shakespeare could shift at pleasure, to inform and animate other existences. But in himself he had an eye to perceive and a soul to embrace all forms. He was a great poet, but his genius was essentially epic, not dramatic. Webster, Middleton, Dekker, Chettle, Marston, Robert Tailor, Tourneur, and Rowley may also be reckoned among the dramatic writers of considerable note who were the contemporaries of Shakespeare, though most or all of them survived him, and none of them began to write so early as he did. John Webster was parish clerk of St. Andrew's, Holborn, and a member of the Merchant Taylors' Company. Of 4 dramatic pieces of which he is the sole author, besides 2 comedies which he wrote in conjunction with Rowley, and other 2 in which he assisted Dekker, his tragedies of the White Devil and the Duchess of Malfi are the most celebrated. The character of Vittoria Corombona, the White Devil, is drawn with great spirit, and the delineation of the Duchess of Malfi displays not only remarkable power and originality of imagination, but a dramatic skill and judgment which perhaps no one of the other writers we have named along with Webster has anywhere matched. None of them has either so little extravagance or so much of the true terrific. To move a horror skilfully, says Lamb, to touch a soul to the quick, to lay upon fear as much as it can bear, to wean and weary a life till it is ready to drop, and then step in with mortal instruments to take its last forfeit, this only a Webster can do. Writers of an inferior genius may, upon horror's head, horrors accumulate, but they cannot do this. Webster seems to have been a slow writer, which it may be presumed few of his contemporaries were. In an advertisement prefixed to his White Devil, he says, "To those who report I was a long time in finishing this tragedy, I confess I do not write with a goose quill winged with 2 feathers, and if they will needs make it my fault, I must answer them with that of Euripides to Alcestides, a tragic writer." Alcestides, objecting that Euripides had only in 3 days composed 3 verses, whereas himself had written 300. "Thou tell'st truth," quoth he, "but here's the difference. Thine shall only be read for 3 days, whereas mine shall continue 3 ages." It will be seen from this passage that Webster was not wanting in a due sense of his own merits. He seems also to have had a sufficient contempt for the public taste of his day, or at least for that of the ordinary audiences of the theatre where his piece had been brought out. "I have noted," he says, "most of the people that come to that playhouse resemble those ignorant asses who, visiting stationers' shops, their use is not to inquire for good books, but new books." And he adds, "Should a man present to such an auditory the most sententious tragedy that ever was written, observing all the critical laws, as height of style and gravity of person, enrich it with the sententious chorus, and as it were enliven death in the passionate and weighty nuntius, yet after all this divine rapture, the breath that comes from the uncapable multitude is able to poison it." It is difficult to discern in all this the modesty which Lamb so much praises. Neither does Webster greatly shine as a critic of the performances of others. In a subsequent paragraph of his advertisement or preface, in which he gives us his opinion as some of his contemporaries, "I have ever," he observes, "truly cherished my good opinion of other men's worthy labours, especially of that full and heightened style of Master Chapman, the laboured and understanding works of Master Jonson, the no less worthy composures of the most worthy excellent Master Beaumont and Master Fletcher, and lastly, without wrong last to be named, the right happy and copious industry of Master Shakespeare, Master Dekker, Master Heywood." All this may be frank enough, as Lamb calls it, but it is certainly not very discriminating. Thomas Middleton is the author, in whole or in part, of between 20 and 30 dramatic pieces, his associates in those which he did not write entirely himself being Dekker, Rowley, Jonson, Fletcher, and Massinger. One of his plays, a comedy called The Old Law, which he wrote in conjunction with Rowley, and which was afterwards improved by Massinger, appears to have been acted so early as 1599, and another was published in 1602. The greater number of his pieces are comedies, and compared with most of his contemporaries, he has a good deal of comic talent. But his most noted dramatic production is his tragi-comedy of The Witch, which remained in manuscript till a small impression of it was printed in 1778 by Isaac Reed, after it had been suggested by Stephens that it had probably been written before Macbeth, and might have been the source from which Shakespeare borrowed his witches in that play. The commentators would have everything in Shakespeare and everybody else to be borrowed or stolen. They have the genius and the zeal of thief-catchers in ferreting out and exposing all transferences among writers, real and imaginary, of thoughts, words, and syllables, and in the present case, as in many others, their professional ardour seems to have made a great deal out of very little. Lamb, in an admirable criticism, has pointed out the essential differences between the witches of Shakespeare and those of Middleton, from whose play, however, Shakespeare appears to have taken a few lines of his incantations, unless indeed, which we think not improbable, the verses in question were common popular rhymes, preserved among the traditions of the nursery or the country fireside. Middleton's witches have little of the supernatural awfulness of Shakespeare's. Their names and some of the properties, as Lamb observes, which Middleton has given to his hags, excite smiles. The weird sisters are serious things. Their presence cannot coexist with mirth, but in a lesser degree the witches of Middleton are fine creations. Their power, too, is in some measure over the mind. They raise jars, jealousies, strifes, like a thick scurfore life. Still another and lower species of witch, the plain traditional old woman witch of our ancestors, as Lamb has called her, poor, deformed, and ignorant, the terror of villages, herself amenable to a justice, is the heroine of the tragi-comedy of the Witch of Edmonton, the joint production of Rowley, Ford, and Dekker. Thomas Dekker was the author of, or a contributor to, more than 30 plays in all, nearly 2/3 of which, however, have perished. He has not much high imagination, but considerable liveliness of fancy, and also no little power of pathos. His best pieces are his comedies of Old Fortunatus and The Honest Whore, and his spirited satyromastics, the principal character in which, Horace Jr., is a humorous caricature of Ben Jonson, who had previously ridiculed Dekker upon the stage in Crispinus, the hero of his satirical comedy of The Poetaster. Dekker is also supposed to be the author of the best parts of the very touching play of Patient Grisel, which appeared in 1603, and which has been reprinted from a unique copy of that edition for the Shakespeare Society, under the care of Mr. Collier, 1841. It was written by him in conjunction with William Houghton, who is the author of several plays of little merit, and Henry Chettle, who was one of the most active and prolific dramatic writers of this time. Although of 8 and 30 plays in which he is stated to have been more or less concerned, only the present and 3 others have been preserved. He has force as well as fertility, but it is apt to run into rant and absurdity. John Marston is the author of 8 plays, and appears to have enjoyed in his own day a great reputation as a dramatist. He is to be classed, however, with Sackville and Chapman, as having more poetical than dramatic genius, although he has given no proof of a creative imagination equal to what is displayed in the early poetry of the former, and the best of Chapman's is instinct with the diviner fire. But he is, nevertheless, a very imposing declaimer in verse. Besides his plays, Marston published 2 volumes of poetry, the second, by which he is best known, a collection of satires, and 3 books entitled The Scourge of Villainy, a set of very vigorous and animated Juvenalian chants. Of Robert Tailor nothing is known, except that he is the author of 1 play, a comedy entitled The Hog Hath Lost His Pearl, which was acted in 1613 and published the following year. It is reprinted in Dodsley's collection, and Mr. Lamb has extracted from it the most interesting scenes, which, however, derive their interest rather from the force of the situation, one that has been turned to better account in other hands, than from anything very impressive in its treatment. The merit of a perspicuous style is nearly all that can be awarded to this writer. Cyril Tourneur is known as the author of 2 surviving dramas, The Revenger's Tragedy and The Atheist's Tragedy, besides a tragi-comedy called The Nobleman, which is lost. The Revenger's Tragedy in particular, which is reprinted in Dodsley's collection, both in the development of character and the conduct of the action, evinces a rare dramatic skill, and the dialogue in parts is wonderfully fine, natural and direct as that of real passion, yet ennobled by the breathing thoughts and burning words of a poetic imagination, by images and lines that plough into the memory and the heart. William Rowley, whose cooperation with the Witch of Edmonton, with Dekker and Ford, has been already noticed, owes the greater part of his reputation to his having been taken into partnership in the composition of some of their pieces by Middleton, Webster, Massinger, and other writers more eminent than himself, but he has also left us a tragedy and 3 comedies of his own. He has his share of the cordial and straightforward manner of our old dramatists, but not a great deal more that is of much value. Of the style of his comedy, a judgment may be formed from the fact, recorded by Langbaine, that certain of the scenes of one of his pieces, A Shoemaker's a Gentleman, used to be commonly performed by the strolling actors at Bartholomew and Southwark fairs. Though he appears to have begun to write, at least in association with others, some 10 years before the death of Shakespeare, Rowley probably survived the middle of the century. So also, it is supposed, did Thomas Heywood, the most rapid and voluminous of English writers, who appears to have written for the stage as early as 1596, but whose last published piece, written in conjunction with Rowley, was not printed till 1655. Heywood, according to his own account, in an address to the reader prefixed to his tragi-comedy of the English Traveller, published in 1633, had then, as he phrases it, had either an entire hand or at least a main finger in the incredible number of 220 dramatic productions. True it is, he adds, that my plays are not exposed into the world in volumes to bear the title of works, as others. One reason is that many of them, by shifting and change of companies, have been negligently lost. Others of them are still retained in the hands of some actors who think it against their peculiar profit to have them come in print. And a third, that it never was any great ambition in me to be in this kind voluminously read. Besides his plays too, Heywood, who was an actor and engaged in the practice of his profession for a great part of his life, wrote numerous other works, several of them large volumes in quarto and folio. Among them are a translation of Sallust, a folio volume entitled The Hierarchy of the Blessed Angels, a general history of women, and another work entitled 9 Books of Various History Concerning Women, a folio of between 400 and 500 pages, which in a Latin note on the last page he tells us was all excogitated, written, and printed in 17 weeks. Of his plays, above 20 are still extant, about a tithe of the prodigious litter. 2 of them, his tragedy of A Woman Killed with Kindness, and his historical play The Four Prentices of London, are in Dodsley. 3 more, his tragi-comedies of The English Traveller, The Royal King, and Loyal Subject, and A Challenge for Beauty, are in Dilke's collection, and about a dozen others have been reprinted for the Shakespeare Society. Lamb has very happily characterized Heywood in a few words. Heywood is a sort of prose Shakespeare. His scenes are to the full as natural and affecting, but we miss the poet, that which in Shakespeare always appears out and above the surface of the nature. His plays, however, are for the greater part in verse, which at least has eased a flow enough, and he may be styled not only a prose Shakespeare, but a more poetical Richardson. If he has not quite the power of Lillie in what has been called the domestic tragedy, which is the species to which his best pieces belong, he excels that modern dramatist both in facility and variety. Beaumont and Fletcher. But the names of the dramatic writers of the present period that hold rank the nearest to Shakespeare still remain to be mentioned. Those of Beaumont and Fletcher must be regarded as indicating one poet rather than 2, for it is impossible to make anything of the contradictory accounts that have been handed down as to their respective shares in the plays published in their conjoint names, and the plays themselves furnish no evidence that is more decisive. The only ascertained facts relating to this point are the following: that John Fletcher was about 10 years older than his friend Francis Beaumont, the former having been born in 1576, the latter in 1585. That Beaumont, however, so far as is known, came first before the world as a writer of poetry, his translation of the story of Salmachus and Hermaphroditus from the 4th book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, having been published in 1602, when he was only in his 17th year. That the Masque of the Inner Temple and Gray's Inn, consisting of only a few pages, produced in 1612, was written by Beaumont alone. That the pastoral drama of The Faithful Shepherdess is entirely Fletcher's. That the first published of the pieces which have been ascribed to the 2 associated together, the comedy of The Woman-Hater, appeared in 1607. That Beaumont died in March 1616, and that between that date and the death of Fletcher in 1625 there were brought out, as appears from the notebook of Sir Henry Herbert, Deputy Master of the Revels, at least 11 of the plays found in the collection of their works, besides 2 others that were brought out in 1626, and 2 more that are lost. Deducting the 14 pieces which thus appear certainly to belong to Fletcher exclusively, except that in one of them, The Maid in the Mill, he is said to have been assisted by Rowley, there still remain 37 or 38, which it is possible they may have written together in the 9 or 10 years over which their poetical partnership is supposed to have extended. 18 of Beaumont and Fletcher's plays, including the Masque by the former and the Pastoral by the latter, were published separately before 1640. 34 more were first published together in a folio volume in 1647, and the whole were reprinted with the addition of a comedy supposed to have been lost, The Wild Goose Chase, making a collection of 53 pieces in all, in another folio in 1679. Beaumont and Fletcher want altogether that white heat of passion by which Shakespeare fuses all things into life and poetry at a touch, often making a single brief utterance flash upon us a full though momentary view of a character, which all that follows deepens and fixes and makes the more like to actual seeing with the eyes and hearing with the ears. His was a deeper, higher, in every way more extended and capacious nature than theirs. They want his profound meditative philosophy as much as they do his burning poetry. Neither have they avoided, nearly to the same degree that he has done, the degradation of their fine gold by the intermixture of baser metal. They have given us all sorts of writing, good, bad, and indifferent, in abundance, without referring in particular to what we now deem the indecency and licentiousness which pollutes all their plays, but which, strange to say, seems not to have been looked upon in that light by anybody in their own age, simply because it is usually wrapped in very transparent double entendre. They might, if judged by nearly one half of all they have left us, be held to belong to almost the lowest rank of our dramatists instead of to the highest. There is scarcely one of their dramas that does not bear marks of haste and carelessness, or of a blight in some part or other from the playhouse tastes or compliances to which they were wont too easily to give themselves up when the louder applause of the day and the town made them thoughtless of their truer fame. But fortunately, on the other hand, in scarcely any of their pieces is the deformity thus occasioned more than partial. The circumstances in which they wrote have somewhat debased the produce of their fine genius, but their genius itself suffered nothing from the unworthy uses it was often put to. It springs up again from the dust and mud, as gay a creature of the element as ever, soaring and singing at heaven's gate as if it had never touched the ground. Nothing can go beyond the flow and brilliancy of the dialogue of these writers in their happier scenes. It is the richest stream of real conversation, edged with the fire of poetry. For the drama of Beaumont and Fletcher is as essentially poetical and imaginative, though not in so high a style as that of Shakespeare, and they too, even if they were not great dramatists, would still be great poets. Much of their verse is among the sweetest in the language, and many of the lyrical passages, in particular, with which their plays are interspersed, have a diviner soul of song in them than almost any other compositions of the same class. As dramatists they are far inferior to Shakespeare, not only, as we have said, in striking development and consistent preservation of character, in other words, in truth and force of conception, but also both in the originality and the variety of their creations in that department. They have confined themselves to a comparatively small number of broadly distinguished figures, which they delineate in a dashing scene-painting fashion, bringing out their peculiarities rather by force of situation and contrast with one another, than by the form and aspect with which each individually looks forth and emerges from the canvas. But all the resources of this inferior style of art they avail themselves of with the boldness of conscious power, and with wonderful skill and effect. Their invention of plot and incident is fertile in the highest degree, and in the conduct of a story for the mere purposes of the stage, for keeping the attention of an audience awake and their expectations suspended throughout the whole course of the action, they excel Shakespeare, who, aiming at higher things and producing his more glowing pictures by fewer strokes, is careless about the mere excitement of curiosity, whereas they are tempted to linger as long as possible over every scene, both for that end and because their proper method of evolving character and passion is by such delay and repetition of touch upon touch. By reason principally of this difference, the plays of Beaumont and Fletcher in the great days of the stage, and so long as the state of public manners tolerated their license and grossness, were much greater favourites than those of Shakespeare in our theatres. Two of theirs, Drayton tells us, were acted in his time for one of Shakespeare's. Their intrigues, their lively and florid but not subtle dialogue, their strongly marked but somewhat exaggerated representations of character, their exhibitions of passion, apt to run a little into the melodramatic, were more level to the general apprehension, and were found to be more entertaining than his higher art and grander poetry. Beaumont and Fletcher, as might be inferred from what has already been said, are, upon the whole, greater in comedy than in tragedy, and they seem themselves to have felt that their genius led them more to the former, for of their plays only 10 are tragedies, while their comedies amount to 24 or 25, the rest being what were then called tragi-comedies, in many of which, however, it is true the interest is, in part at least, of a tragic character, although the story ends happily. But, on the other hand, all their tragedies have also some comic passages, and in regard to this matter indeed their plays may be generally described as consisting, in the words of the prologue to one of them, of passionate scenes mixed with no vulgar mirth. Undoubtedly, taking them all in all, they have left us the richest and most magnificent drama we possess after that of Shakespeare, the most instinct and alive both with the true dramatic spirit and with that of general poetic beauty and power, the most brilliantly lighted up with wit and humour, the freshest and most vivid, as well as various picture of human manners and passions, the truest mirror, and at the same time the finest embellishment of nature. Jonson. Ben Jonson was born in 1574, or 2 years before Fletcher, whom he survived 12 years, dying in 1637. He is supposed to have begun to write for the stage so early as 1593, but nothing that he produced attracted any attention till his comedy of Every Man in his Humour was brought out at the Rose Theatre in 1596. This play, greatly altered and improved, was published in 1598, and between that date and his death Jonson produced above 50 more dramatic pieces in all, of which 10 are comedies, 3 what he called comical satires, only 2 tragedies, and all the rest masques, pageants, or other court entertainments. His 2 tragedies of Sejanus and Catiline are admitted on all hands to be nearly worthless, and his fame rests almost entirely upon his first comedy. His 3 subsequent comedies of Volpone, or the Fox, Apocene, or the Silent Woman, and the Alchemist, his court masque, and a pastoral entitled The Sad Shepherd, which was left unfinished at his death. Ben Jonson's comedies admit of no comparison with those of Shakespeare, or of Beaumont and Fletcher. He belongs to another school. His plays are professed attempts to revive, in English, the old classic Roman drama, and aim in their construction at a rigorous adherence to the models afforded by those of Plautus and Terence and Seneca. They are admirable for their elaborate art, which is moreover informed by a power of strong conception of a decidedly original character. They abound both in wit and eloquence, which in some passages rises to the glow of poetry. The figures of the scene stand out in high relief, every one of them, from the most important to the most insignificant, being finished off at all points with the minutest care. The dialogue carries on the action, and is animated in many parts with the right dramatic reciprocation, and the plot is in general contrived and evolved with the same learned skill and the same attention to details that are shown in all other particulars. But the execution, even where it is most brilliant, is hard and angular. Nothing seems to flow naturally and freely. The whole has an air of constraint and effort and exaggeration, and the effect that is produced by the most arresting passages is the most undramatic that can be, namely, a greater sympathy with the performance as a work of art than as anything else. It may be added that Jonson's characters, though vigorously delineated, and though not perhaps absolutely false to nature, are most of them rather of the class of her occasional excrescences or eccentricities than samples of any general humanity. They are the oddities and perversions of a particular age or state of manners, and have no universal truth or interest. What is called the humour of Jonson consists entirely in the exhibition of the more ludicrous kinds of these morbid aberrations. Like everything about him, it has force and raciness enough, but will be most relished by those who are most amused by dancing bears and other shows of that class. It seldom or never makes the heart laugh, like the humour of Shakespeare, which is indeed a quality of altogether another essence. As a poet, Jonson is greatest in his masques and other court pageants. The airy elegance of these compositions is a perfect contrast to the stern and rugged strength of his other works. The lyrical parts of them especially have often a grace and sportiveness, a flow as well as a finish, the effect of which is very brilliant. Still, even in these, we want the dewy light and rich coloured irradiation of the poetry of Shakespeare and Fletcher. The lustre is pure and bright, but at the same time cold and sharp, like that of crystal. In Jonson's unfinished pastoral of the Sad Shepherd there is some picturesque description and more very harmonious verse, and the best parts of it, much of it is poor enough, are perhaps in a higher style than anything else he has written. But to compare it, as has sometimes been done, either as a poem or as a drama, with the faithful shepherdess of Fletcher, seems to us to evince a deficiency of true feeling for the highest things, equal to what would be shown by preferring, as has also been done by some critics, the humour of Jonson to that of Shakespeare. Fletcher's pastoral, blasted as it is in some parts by fire not from heaven, is still a green and leafy wilderness of poetical beauty. Jonson's, deformed also by some brutality more elaborate than anything of the same sort in Fletcher, is at the best but a trim garden, and had it been ever so happily finished, would have been nothing more. Massinger Ford, After Shakespeare, Beaumont, and Fletcher, and Jonson, the next great name in our drama is that of Philip Massinger, who was born in 1584 and is supposed to have begun to write for the stage soon after 1606, although his first published play, his tragedy of the Virgin Martyr, in which he was assisted by Dekker, did not appear till 1622. Of 38 dramatic pieces which he is said to have written, only 18 have been preserved. 8 others were in the collection of Mr. Warburton, which his servant destroyed. Massinger, like Jonson, had received a learned education, and his classic reading has coloured his style and manner, but he has scarcely so much originality of genius as Jonson. He is a very eloquent writer, but has little power of high imagination or pathos, and still less wit or comic power. He could rise, however, to a vivid conception of a character, moved by some single aim or passion, and he has drawn some of the darker shades of villainy with great force. His Sir Giles Overreach in A New Way to Pay Old Debts, and his Luke in The City Madam, are perhaps his most successful delineations in this style. In the conduct of his plots also he generally displays much skill. In short, all that can be reached by mere talent and warmth of susceptibility he has achieved, but his province was to appropriate and decorate rather than to create. John Ford, the author of about a dozen plays that have survived, and one of whose pieces is known to have been acted so early as 1613, has one quality, that of a deep pathos, perhaps more nearly allied to high genius than any Massinger has shown, but the range of the latter in the delineation of action and passion is so much more extensive that we can hardly refuse to regard him as the greater dramatist. Ford's blank verse is not so imposing as Massinger's, but it has often a delicate beauty, sometimes a warbling wildness and richness, beyond anything in Massinger's fuller swell. End of section 50. Section 51 of A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1, by George Lillie CRAIK, Chapter 4, Part 27. Later Elizabethan prose writers. Even the prose literature of the present period is much of it of so imaginative a character that it may be considered to be a kind of half-poetry. We have already traced the change which English prose writing underwent in the course of the second and third quarters of the 16th century, passing from the familiar but elegant simplicity of the style of Sir Thomas More to the more formal and elaborate but still succinct and unencumbered rhetoric of Ascham, from thence to the affectations of Lillie, the Euphuist, and his imitators, and finally out of what we may call that sickly and unnatural state of transition to the richly decorated eloquence of Sidney. Along with Sidney's famous work, though of somewhat later date, may be mentioned his friend Spenser's View of the State of Ireland, written, as has been already intimated, probably in the year 1596. It is a composition worthy of the many-visioned poet, full of matter, full of thought, full of life, with passages of description in it that make present the distant and the past, like the painter's colours. The style has not so much that is outwardly imposing as Sidney's, but more inward vigour and earnestness, as well as more compactness and sinew; in short, more of the true glow of eloquence, more of a heart leaping within it, and sending a pulse through every word and cadence. On the whole, by the end of the 16th century, our prose, as exhibited in its highest examples, if it had lost something in ease and clearness, had gained considerably in copiousness, in sonorousness, and in splendour. In its inferior specimens also a corresponding change is to be traced, but of a modified character. In these the ancient simplicity and directness had given place only to a long-winded wordiness, and an awkwardness and intricacy, sometimes so excessive as to be nearly unintelligible, produced by piling clause upon clause, and involution upon involution, in the endeavour to crowd into every sentence as much meaning or as many particulars as possible. Here the change was nearly altogether for the worse. The loss in one direction was compensated by hardly anything that could be called a gain in another. It ought also to be noticed that towards the close of the reign of Elizabeth a singularly artificial mode of composition became fashionable, more especially in sermons and other theological writings, consisting mainly in the remotest or most recondite analogies of thought and the most elaborate verbal ingenuities or conceits. This may be designated the opposite pole in popular preaching to what we have in the plainness and simplicity, natural sometimes even to buffoonery, of Latimer. Translation of the Bible. The authorized translation of the Bible, on the whole so admirable both for correctness and beauty of style, is apt on the first thought to be regarded as exhibiting the actual state of the language in the time of James the First, when it was first published. It is to be remembered, however, that the new translation was formed by the special directions of the king upon the basis of that of Parker's, or the Bishop's Bible, which had been made nearly 40 years before, and which had itself been founded upon that of Cranmer, made in the reign of Henry VIII. The consequence is, as Mr. Hallam has remarked, that whether the style of King James's translation be the perfection of the English language or no, it is not the language of his reign. It may, in the eyes of many, adds Mr. Hallam, be a better English, but it is not the English of Daniel, or Rowley, or Bacon, as any one may easily perceive. It abounds, in fact, especially in the Old Testament, with obsolete phraseology, and with single words long since abandoned, or retained only in provincial use. This is perhaps rather strongly put, for although the preceding version served as a general guide to the translators and was not needlessly deviated from, they have evidently modernized its style, not perhaps quite up to that of their own day, but so far we apprehend as to exclude nearly all words and phrases that had then passed out even of common and familiar use. In that theological age, indeed, few forms of expression found in the Bible could well have fallen altogether into desuetude, although some may have come to be less apt and significant than they once were, or than others that might now be substituted for them. But we believe the new translators, in any changes they made, were very careful to avoid the employment of any mere words of yesterday, the glare of whose recent coinage would have contrasted offensively with the general antique colour of diction which they desired to retain. If ever their version were to be revised, whether to improve the rendering of some passages by the lights of modern criticism, or to mend some hardness and intricacy of construction in others, it ought to be retouched in the same spirit of affectionate veneration for the genius and essential characteristics of its beautiful diction, and a good rule to be laid down might be, that no word should be admitted in the improved renderings which was not in use in the age when the translation was originally made. The language was then abundantly rich enough to furnish all the words that could be wanted for the purpose. Theological writers: James I, Bishop Andrews, Donne, Hall, Hooker. Besides the translation of the Bible, the portion of the English literature of the present period that is theological is very great in point of quantity, and a part of it also possesses distinguished claims to notice in a literary point of view. Religion was the great subject of speculation and controversy in this country throughout the entire space of a century and a half between the Reformation and the Revolution, and nothing can more strikingly illustrate the universality of the interest that was now taken in theological controversy than the fact that both the kings whose reigns filled the first half of the 17th century have left us a considerable quantity of literary manufacture of their own, and that it is almost all theological. The writings of Charles I will be noticed afterwards. King James, whose works were collected and published in a folio volume in 1616, under the care of Dr. Montague, Bishop of Winchester, had given to the world what he called a fruitful meditation upon part of the Apocalypse, in form of a sermon, so early as the year 1588, when he was only a youth of 22. Indeed, according to Bishop Montague's account, this performance was written by his Majesty before he was 20 years of age. Soon after, on the destruction of the Spanish Armada, he produced another meditation on certain verses of one of the chapters of the first book of Chronicles. Among his subsequent publications are meditations on the Lord's Prayer and on some verses of the 27th chapter of St. Matthew, and nearly all his other works, his Demonology, first published in 1597, his True Law of Free Monarchies, 1598, his Basilicon Doron, or Advice to his son Prince Henry, 1599, his Apology for the Oath of Allegiance, 1605, are, in the main, theological treatises. It is scarcely necessary to add that they are of little or no value, either theological or literary, though they are curious as illustrating the intellectual and moral character of James, who was certainly a person of no depth either of learning or of judgment, though of some reading in the single province of theology, and also of considerable shrewdness and readiness, and an inexhaustible flow of words, which he mistook for eloquence and genius. One of the most eminent preachers, perhaps the most eminent of the age of Elizabeth and James, was Dr. Lancelot Andrewes, who, after having held the sees of Chichester and Ely, died Bishop of Winchester in 1626. Bishop Andrewes was one of the translators of the Bible, and is the author, among other works, of a folio volume of sermons published, by direction of Charles I, soon after his death; of another folio volume of tracts and speeches, which appeared in 1629; of a third volume of lectures on the 10 Commandments, published in 1642; and of a fourth, containing lectures delivered at St. Paul's and at St. Giles's, Cripplegate, published in 1657. He was perhaps the most learned of the English theologians of that learned time, and was, besides, a person of great vigour and acuteness of understanding, so that his death was regarded by scholars both at home and abroad as the extinction of the chief light of the English Church. Milton, then a youth of 17, bewailed the event in a Latin elegy full of feeling and fancy, and even in a tract written many years afterwards, when his opinions had undergone a complete change, he admits that Bishop Andrewes of late years, and in these times the primate of Armagh, Usher, for their learning, are reputed the best able to say what may be said in defence of episcopacy. Both the learning and ability of Andrewes indeed are conspicuous in everything he has written, but his eloquence nevertheless is to a modern taste grotesque enough. In his more ambitious passages he is the very prince of verbal posture masters, if not the first in date, the first in extravagance of the artificial, quibbling, syllable, tormenting school of our English pulpit rhetoricians. And he undoubtedly contributed more to spread the disease of that manner of writing than any other individual. Not only did his eminence in this line endear him to the royal tastes of Elizabeth and James, all men admired and strove to copy after him. Fuller declares that he was an inimitable preacher in his way, and then he tells us that pious and pleasant Bishop Felton, his contemporary and colleague, endeavoured in vain in his sermons to assimilate his style, and therefore said merrily of himself, "I had almost marred my own natural trot by endeavouring to imitate his artificial amble." Many a natural trot Andrews no doubt was the cause of spoiling in his day and long after it. This bishop is further very notable in the history of the English Church as the first great asserter of those semi-popish notions touching doctrines, rites, and ecclesiastical government with which Laud afterwards blew up the establishment. Andrews, however, was a very different sort of person from Laud, as superior to him in sense and policy, as in learning and general strength and comprehensiveness of understanding. A well-known story that is told of him proves his moderation as much as his wit and readiness. When he and Dr. Neale, Bishop of Durham, were one day standing behind the king's chair as he sat at dinner, it was the day on which James dissolved his third Parliament, and the anecdote is related on the authority of Waller, the poet, who was present. His Majesty, turning round, addressed the two prelates. "My lords, cannot I take my subjects' money when I want it, without all this formality in Parliament?" The Bishop of Durham readily answered, "God forbid, sir, but you should. You are the breath of our nostrils." Whereupon the king turned and said to the Bishop of Winchester, "Well, my lord, what say you?" "Sir," replied the bishop, "I have no skill to judge of parliamentary cases." The king answered, "No put-offs, my lord. Answer me presently." "Then, sir," said he, "I think it is lawful for you to take my brother Neale's money, for he offers it." Clarendon has expressed his belief that if Archbishop Bancroft had been succeeded in the see of Canterbury by Andrews instead of Abbot, the infection of the Geneva fire would have been kept out, which could not afterwards be so easily expelled. Donne, the poet, was also a voluminous writer in prose, having left a folio volume of sermons, besides a treatise against popery, entitled The Pseudo-Martyr, another singular performance, entitled Beathanatos, in confutation of the common notion about the necessary sinfulness of suicide, and some other professional disquisitions. His biographer, Isaac Walton, says that he preached as an angel from a cloud, but not in a cloud. But most modern readers will probably be of opinion that he has not quite made his escape from it. His manner is fully as quaint in his prose as in his verse, and his way of thinking as subtle and peculiar. His sermons are also, as well as those of Andrews, overlaid with learning, much of which seems to be only a useless and cumbersome show. Doubtless, however, there are deep and beautiful things in Donne for those that will seek for them, as has indeed been testified by some who in modern times have made themselves the best acquainted with these long-neglected theological works of his. Another of the most learned theologians and eloquent preachers of those times was, as well as Donne, an eminent poet, Bishop Joseph Hall. Hall's English prose works, which are very voluminous, consist of sermons, polemical tracts, paraphrases of Scripture, casuistical divinity, and some pieces on practical religion, of which his Contemplations, his Art of Divine Meditation, and his Enochiasmus, or Treatise on the Mode of Walking with God, are the most remarkable. The poetic temperament of Hall reveals itself, in his prose as well as in his verse, by the fervour of his piety, and the forcible and often picturesque character of his style, in which it has been thought he made Seneca his model. The writer of the Satires, observes Warton, is perceptible in some of his gravest polemical or scriptural treatises, which are perpetually interspersed with excursive illustrations, familiar allusions, and observations on life. It will be perceived from all this that both in style and in mind Hall and Donne were altogether opposed. Neither in his prose nor in his verse has the former the originality of the latter, or the fineness of thought that will often break out in a sudden streak of light from the midst of his dark sayings. But on the other hand, he is perfectly free from the dominant vices of Donne's manner, his conceits, his quaintness, his remote and fantastic analogies, his obscurity, his harshness, his parade of a useless and encumbering erudition. Last of all may be mentioned among the great theological writers of this great theological time, one who stands alone, Richard Hooker, the illustrious author of the 8 books of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, of which the first 4 were published in 1594, the 5th in 1597, the 3 last not till 1632, many years after the author's death. Hooker's style is almost without a rival for its sustained dignity of march, but that which makes it most remarkable is its union of all this learned gravity and correctness with a flow of genuine racy English, almost as little tinctured with pedantry as the most familiar popular writing. The effect also of its evenness of movement is the very reverse of tameness or languor. The full river of the argument dashes over no precipices, but yet rolls along without pause and with great force and buoyancy. Bacon, undoubtedly the principal figure in English prose literature as well as in philosophy during the first quarter of the 17th century, is Francis Bacon. Bacon, born in 1561, published the first edition of his Essays in 1597. His 2 books of the Advancement of Learning in 1605, his Wisdom of the Ancients in Latin in 1610, a 3rd edition of his Essays greatly extended in 1612, his 2 books of the Novum Organum, or second part of the Instauratio Magna, designed to consist of 6 parts, also in Latin, in 1620. His History of the Reign of Henry VII in 1622, his 9 books De Argumentis Scientiarum, a Latin translation and extension of his Advancement of Learning in 1623. He died in 1626. The originality of the Baconian, or inductive method of philosophy, the actual service it has rendered to science, and even the end which it may be most correctly said to have in view, have all been subjects of dispute almost ever since Bacon's own day. But notwithstanding all differences of opinion upon these points, the acknowledgment that he was intellectually one of the most colossal of the sons of men has been nearly unanimous. They who have not seen his greatness under one form have discovered it in another. There is a discordance among men's ways of looking at him, or their theories respecting him, but the mighty shadow which he projects athwart the 2 bygone centuries lies there immovable, and still extending as time extends. The very deductions which are made from his merits in regard to particular points thus only heighten the impression of his general eminence, of that something about him, not fully understood or discerned, which, spite of all curtailment of his claims in regard to one special kind of eminence or another, still leaves the sense of his eminence as strong as ever. As for his Novum Organum, or so-called new instrument of philosophy, it may be that it was not really new when he announced it as such, either as a process followed in the practice of scientific discovery, or as a theory of the right method of discovery. Neither may Bacon have been the first writer in his own or the immediately preceding age who recalled attention to the inductive method, or who pointed out the barrenness of what was then called philosophy in the schools. Nor can it be affirmed that it was really he who brought the reign of that philosophy to a close. It was falling fast into disrepute before he assailed it, and would probably have passed away quite as soon as it did, although his writings had never appeared. Nor possibly has he either looked at that old philosophy with a very penetrating or comprehensive eye, or even shown a perfect understanding of the inductive method in all its applications and principles. As for his attempts in the actual practice of the inductive method, they were, it must be owned, either insignificant or utter failures, and that, too, while some of his contemporaries, who in no respect acknowledged him as their teacher, were turning it to account and extorting from nature the most brilliant revelations. Nay, can it be doubted that if Bacon had never lived or never written, the discoveries and the writings of Galileo and Kepler and Pascal, and others who were now extending the empire of science by the very method which he has explained and recommended, but most assuredly without having been instructed in that method by him, would have established the universal recognition of it as the right method of philosophy just as early as such recognition actually took place. That Bacon's Novum Organum has, even down to the present day, affected in any material degree the actual progress of science, may be very reasonably questioned. What great discovery or improvement can be named, among all those that have been made since his time, which, from the known facts of its history, we may not fairly presume would have been made at any rate, though the Novum Organum had never been written? What instance can be quoted of the study of that work having made, or even greatly contributed to make, any individual a discoverer in science, who would not in all probability have been equally such if he had never seen or heard of it? In point of fact, there is no reason to believe that almost any of those by whom science has been most carried forward since it appeared had either much studied Bacon's Novum Organum, or had even acquired any intimate or comprehensive acquaintance with the rules and directions therein laid down from other sources. Nor is it likely that they would have been more successful experimenters or greater discoverers if they had. For there is surely nothing in any part of the method of procedure prescribed by Bacon for the investigation of truth that would not occur of itself to the sagacity and common sense of any person of an inventive genius pursuing such investigation. Indeed, every discovery that has been made, except by accident, since science had any being, must have been arrived at by the very processes which he has explained. There can be little doubt that it would be found on a survey of the whole history of scientific discovery, that its progress has always depended partly upon the remarkable genius of individuals, partly upon the general state of the world and the condition of civilization at different times, and not in any sensible degree upon the mere speculative views as to the right method of philosophy that have at particular eras been taught in schools or books, or otherwise generally diffused. In fact, it is much more reasonable to suppose that such speculative views should have been usually influenced by the actual progress of discovery than it by them, for the recognition of sound principles of procedure, in as far as that is implied in their practical application, though not perhaps the contemplation and exposition of them in a systematic form, is necessarily involved, as has been just observed, in the very act of scientific discovery. All this being considered, there cannot well be attributed to Bacon's Novum Organum any considerable direct share, nor even much indirect influence in promoting the progress which science has made in certain departments since his time. It is most probable that that progress is to be traced to other causes altogether, and that it would have been pretty nearly what it is, though the Novum Organum never had been written. Galileo, and not Bacon, is the true father of modern natural philosophy. That, in truth, was not Bacon's province at all. Neither his acquirements nor the peculiar character and constitution of his mind fitted him for achieving anything on that ground. The common mistake regarding him is the same as if it were to be said that not Homer but Aristotle was the father of poetry, because he first investigated and explained the principles or philosophy of a part of the art of poetry. Bacon belongs not to mathematical or natural science, but to literature, and to moral science in its most extensive acceptation, to the realm of imagination, of wit, of eloquence, of aesthetics, of history, of jurisprudence, of political philosophy, of logic, of metaphysics, and the investigation of the powers and operations of the human mind. He is either not at all, or in no degree worth mentioning as an investigator or expounder of mathematics, or of mechanics, or of astronomy, or of chemistry, or of any other branch of geometrical or physical science. But he is a most penetrating and comprehensive investigator, and a most magnificent expounder of that higher wisdom, in comparison with which all these things are but a more intellectual sort of legerdemain. All his works, his essays, his philosophical writings, commonly so called, and what he has done in history, are of one and the same character, reflective, and, so to speak, poetical, not simply demonstrative or elucidatory of mere matters of fact. What then is his glory? In what did his greatness consist? In this, we should say, that an intellect at once one of the most capacious and one of the most profound ever granted to a mortal, in its powers of vision, at the same time one of the most penetrating and one of the most far-reaching, was in him united and reconciled with an almost equal endowment of the imaginative faculty, and that he is therefore of all philosophical writers the one in whom are found together, in the largest proportions, depth of thought and splendor of eloquence. His intellectual ambition also, a quality of the imagination, was of the most towering character, and no other philosophic writer has taken up so grand a theme as that on which he has laid out his strength in his greatest works. But with the progress of scientific discovery that has taken place during the last 200 years, it would be difficult to show that these works have had almost anything to do. His advancement of learning and his Novum Organum have more in them of the spirit of poetry than of science, and we should almost as soon think of fathering modern physical science upon Paradise Lost as upon them. A late distinguished writer, Mr. Hallam, in his History of European Literature, although his estimate of what Bacon has done for science is much higher than we are able to go along with, yet in the following passage seems to come very near to the admission of, or at least very strongly to corroborate, much of what has just been advanced. It is evident that he had turned his thoughts to physical philosophy, rather for an exercise of his reasoning faculties, and out of his insatiable thirst for knowledge, than from any peculiar aptitude for these or such subjects, much less any advantage of opportunity for their cultivation. He was more eminently the philosopher of human than of general nature. Hence he is exact as well as profound in all his reflections on civil life and mankind, while his conjectures in natural philosophy, though often very acute, are apt to wander far from the truth in consequence of his defective acquaintance with the phenomena of nature. His Centuries of Natural History give abundant proof of this. He is, in all these inquiries, like one doubtfully and by degrees making out a distant prospect, but often deceived by the haze. But if we compare what may be found in the 6th, 7th, and 8th books, De Argumentis, in the Essays, the History of Henry VII, and the various short treatises contained in his works on moral and political wisdom, and on human nature, from experience of which all such wisdom is drawn, with the rhetoric, ethics, and politics of Aristotle, or with the historians most celebrated for their deep insight into civil society and human character, with Thucydides, Tacitus, Philip de Comines, Machiavel, Davila, Hume, we shall, I think, find that one man may almost be compared with all of these together. When Galileo is named as equal to Bacon, it is to be remembered that Galileo was no moral or political philosopher, and in this department Leibnitz certainly falls very short of Bacon. Burke perhaps comes, of all modern writers, the nearest to him, but though Bacon may not be more profound than Burke, he is still more copious and comprehensive. Burton. A remarkable prose work of this age, which ought not to be passed over without notice, is Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Robert Burton, who on his title page takes the name of Democritus Jr., died in 1640, and his book was first published in 1621. It is an extraordinary accumulation of out-of-the-way learning, interspersed somewhat in the manner of Montaigne's essays, with original matter, but with this, among other differences, that in Montaigne the quotations have the air of being introduced, as we know that in fact they were, to illustrate the original matter, which is the web of the discourse, they but the embroidery, whereas in Burton the learning is rather the web, upon which what he has got to say of his own is worked in by way of forming a sort of decorative figure. Burton is far from having the variety or abundance of Montaigne, but there is considerable point and penetration in his style, and he says many striking things in a sort of half splenetic, half jocular humour, which many readers have found wonderfully stimulating. Dr. Jonson declared that Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy was the only book that ever drew him out of bed an hour sooner than he would otherwise have got up. Historical writers. Among the historical writers of the reign of James may be first mentioned the all-accomplished Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh is the author of a few short poems and of some miscellaneous pieces in prose, but his great work is his History of the World, composed during his imprisonment in the Tower, and first published in a folio volume in 1614. It is an unfinished work, coming down only to the First Macedonian War, and there is no reason to suppose that any more of it was ever written, although it has been asserted that a second volume was burnt by the author. Raleigh's history, as a record of facts, has long been superseded. The interest it possesses at the present day is derived almost entirely from its literary merits, and from a few passages in which the author takes occasion to allude to circumstances that have fallen within his own experience. Much of it is written without any ambition of eloquence, but the style, even where it is most careless, is still lively and exciting, from a tone of the actual world which it preserves, and a certain frankness and heartiness coming from Raleigh's profession and his warm impetuous character. It is not disfigured by any of the petty pedantries to some one or other of which most of the writers of books in that day gave way more or less, and it has altogether comparative little of the taint of age upon it, while in some passages the composition, without losing anything of its natural grace and heartiness, is wrought up to great rhetorical polish and elevation. Another celebrated historical work of this time is Richard Knowles's History of the Turks, published in 1610. Jonson, in one of his Ramblers, has awarded to Knowles the first place among English historians, and Mr. Hallam concurs in thinking that his style and power of narration have not been too highly extolled by that critic. His descriptions, continues Mr. Hallam, are vivid and animated, circumstantial, but not to feebleness. His characters are drawn with a strong pencil. In the style of Knowles, there is sometimes, as Jonson has hinted, a slight excess of desire to make every phrase effective, but he is exempt from the usual blemishes of his age, and his command of the language is so extensive that we should not err in placing him among the first of our elder writers. Much of this praise, however, is to be considered as given to the uniformity or regularity of Knowles's style, the chief fault of which perhaps is that it is too continuously elaborated and sustained for a long work. We have already mentioned Samuel Daniel's History of England, from the Conquest to the reign of Edward III, which was published in 1618. It is of little historical value, but is remarkable for the same simple ease and purity of language which distinguished Daniel's verse. The contribution to this department of literature of all those that the early part of the 17th century produced, which is at the same time the most valuable as an original authority and the most masterly in its execution, is undoubtedly Bacon's History of the Reign of Henry VII. The series of popular national chronicles was continued in this period, from the publication of Edward Hall's Union of the two noble and illustrious families of York and Lancaster in 1548, by that of Richard Grafton's Chronicle at Large, down to the first year of Queen Elizabeth in 1569, of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1577, and by the various publications of the laborious antiquaries John Stow and John Speed, namely Stow's Summary of the English Chronicles, of which he published many editions between 1565 and 1598. His Annals, also frequently reprinted with corrections and enlargements between 1573 and 1600. His Survey of London, first published in 1598, and again with additions in 1603, and Speed's Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain, 1606, and his History of Great Britain, coming down to the accession of James I, 1614. These various works of Stow and Speed rank among the head sources or fountains of our knowledge in the department of national antiquities. Classical learning, with the exception of a magnificent edition of Chrysostom in 8 volumes folio by Sir Henry Savile, printed at Eton, where Savile was provost of the college in 1612, scarcely any great work in the department of ancient scholarship appeared in England in the portion of the 17th century which preceded the breaking out of the Civil War. It, however, produced a number of works written in Latin by Englishmen which still retain more or less celebrity, among others the illustrious Camden's Britannia, first published in 1586, but not enlarged to the form in which its author ultimately left it till the appearance of the 6th edition in 1607, the same writer's Annales Rerum Anglicarum Regnante Elizabetha, the first part of which was printed in 1615, the sequel not till after Camden's death. John Barclay's 2 poetical romances of the Euphormio, the first part of which was published in 1603, and the more famous are Genus, 1621, Lord Herbert's Treatise de Raritate, 1624, and the Mare Clausum, the Uxor Hebraica, and other works of the most learned John Selden. End of section 51. End of A Compendious History of English Literature and of the English Language, Volume 1 by George Lillie CRAIK.